The cop had him face down on the hood of his own car, wrists already cinched in steel, less than 200 yards from the front gate of the military installation he commanded. Colonel Darius Merritt, 26 years of combat service, 2 wars, 4 commendations, was being called boy by a rookie with 3 years on the badge and a chip the size of a boulder on his shoulder. The cop didn't read the military ID, didn't want to. He was already writing the story in his head. Then the ground started shaking. Steel barriers erupted from the asphalt. Floodlights from the guard towers hit like a second sun. And 8 Marines with rifles came out of those armored vehicles moving like they had something to prove. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person and live to see the whole thing collapse on them, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The drive from the capital should have taken 4 hours. It took Darius Merritt 6, because somewhere outside of Haverford, the rain came down so hard the interstate turned into a black mirror, and he had to pull under an overpass and wait it out with a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. He didn't mind. After 4 days trapped in a Pentagon conference room, arguing operational logistics with people who'd never set foot in a forward operating base, the silence of a parked car and rain hammering the roof felt close to paradise. He was 51 years old. His knees ached when the weather changed, which was most of the time on the coast. There was a scar that ran along his left forearm from a piece of shrapnel he'd caught in Korengal Valley that tightened in the cold, and he'd long since stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a wall you pass every day. He wore jeans that had been washed so many times they'd faded at the knees, a dark green Henley, and a canvas jacket that had seen better decades. His hair was cut close to the scalp, going gray at the temples. He looked, by any casual glance, like a contractor heading home from a long job, which was exactly how he preferred it. The base, Harmon Marine Corps Installation, sat on a stretch of the Southern California coast about 40 minutes north of the city of Pelican Bluffs. It occupied nearly 18,000 acres of prime coastal land and housed over 12,000 active-duty personnel. Darius Merritt had commanded it for the last 2 years. The weight of that responsibility was not something he wore on his sleeve. He carried it the way a man carries a loaded pack, adjusted, balanced, and never forgotten. He merged back onto the highway just after 11 at night. The rain had thinned to a mist. The highway was mostly empty, a few long-haul trucks running south, their running lights reflecting off the slick asphalt in long orange streaks. Merritt set the cruise control at exactly 63 miles per hour. The speed limit was 60, and settled back into the seat of his 2009 Chevy Trailblazer, a vehicle he'd owned since before his last deployment and refused to replace on principle. It ran fine. That was enough. He was 7 miles from Gate 5 of Harmon Installation when the headlights filled his rearview mirror. He noticed them the way a man with 26 years of situational awareness notices everything, quietly, cataloged, filed. The vehicle had come up fast, closing distance at a rate that suggested either urgency or aggression, then settled into a position about 2 car lengths behind him. Close enough to be uncomfortable, he maintained his speed, kept both hands on the wheel, and waited. The light stayed there for nearly a mile. Then the light bar ignited. Red and blue exploded through the interior of the Trailblazer, bouncing off the mirrors and filling the cabin with a strobe effect that made the wet road look like it was pulsing. Merritt exhaled through his nose, a single controlled breath, and reached down to switch his hazards on. He checked his mirrors. The patrol car was Pelican Bluffs Police Department, municipal, not highway patrol. He checked his position on the road. He had not drifted. He had not exceeded the limit. He was doing nothing wrong. He activated his right turn signal and began decelerating smoothly, pulling toward the right shoulder as the reflective green sign for Gate 5 came into view ahead. The approach lane to the gate was well lit, maintained, and clearly marked, about 200 yards up on the right. Merritt steered the Trailblazer onto the approach lane and brought it to a stop just past a faded yellow line painted across the asphalt. He knew that line. He'd had it repainted himself 8 months ago after the boundary demarcation review. On this side of it, you were on Harmon Installation, federal property. He shut the engine off, lowered the window, and placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The patrol car parked behind him at an angle, its light bar still churning. A door slammed. Boots crunched on wet asphalt. Merritt tracked the approach in his side mirror, a figure moving with that particular swagger of someone who'd decided this interaction was going to go a specific way before it started. Officer Kyle Drayton was 29 years old and had been with Pelican Bluffs PD for 3 years and 4 months. He was built like someone who'd played high school football and never entirely let go of that identity. Broad through the shoulders, thick neck, a jaw that led his face forward when he walked. He had a reputation in the department that depended entirely on who you asked. His supervisor called him eager. His training officer, who'd transferred out 6 months after Drayton passed probation, had used a different word in a private conversation that never made it into any official record. Drayton didn't like the Gate 5 perimeter assignment. He'd made that clear to his watch commander enough times that it had stopped being a complaint and started being a known condition, like a weather pattern. The military people mostly stayed inside the wire. When they did come out, they tended to be polite, professional, and boring. The highway was quiet. Nothing ever happened. Tonight he'd been parked on a commercial access road just off the highway, running plates on passing vehicles out of boredom when he spotted the Trailblazer. Older vehicle. Out-of-state tags. Georgia registration, though he didn't wait for the plate returned to fully process before he was already pulling out behind it. He'd followed for a mile, watching. The driving was technically perfect, which Drayton had long since trained himself to interpret as a sign of someone trying too hard. The microscopic rightward drift, the Trailblazer's right tires made passing a curve, barely a foot, well within any reasonable standard, was all he needed. He stopped at the driver's side window, positioning himself slightly behind the B-pillar, and shined his flashlight directly into the driver's face. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," he said. No greeting, no courtesy. Merritt squinted against the beam without flinching. "Good evening, officer. My wallet is in my right back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now." "I didn't ask for a play-by-play, just get the documents." Merritt moved slowly and deliberately, extracting his wallet from his back pocket. He pulled out 2 cards and held them through the window, his Georgia driver's license and his military ID. The Department of Defense card was the kind that identified him as an active-duty 06, full-bird colonel, current command assignment listed plainly in the data field. Drayton snatched them from his hand. He glanced at the driver's license, turned it over, looked at the military ID for less than 3 seconds. Then he shoved the military ID back through the window. "I don't need your base access card or whatever gym membership this is. I need registration and proof of insurance." Merritt looked at the ID in his own hand for a moment. Then he looked back at the officer. "That's a Department of Defense identification card, officer. My name and rank are on the face of it." "What are you doing out here this late?" "I'm returning to my quarters. I'm the commanding officer of Harmon Installation. My quarters are on base." Drayton tilted his head slowly. The motion had a particular quality to it, the kind of performative skepticism that was less about doubt and more about theater. "Right, commanding officer." He looked at the Trailblazer. He looked at Merritt's canvas jacket. "You expect me to believe the base commander drives something like this and dresses like that?" "I expect you to read the identification I provided you," Merritt said, his voice level, each word clear and measured. "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer." "Step out of the vehicle, sir." The "sir" came out like an insult wearing a costume. Merritt ran a fast, quiet calculation. He was past the boundary line, technically on federal jurisdiction, but the officer either hadn't noticed or didn't care, and arguing that point from inside a car with a man who was already coiled tight was not how this needed to go. He reached for the door handle. "I'm stepping out. I am unarmed. I am going to move slowly." He opened the door and unfolded from the seat, standing to his full height. He was 6'1", not a large man in the obvious sense, but there was something in the way he occupied space that made the air around him feel organized. He stood with his shoulders squared and his hands visible, palms slightly open. A combat veteran's muscle memory, the deliberate signaling of non-threat, the kind of practiced stillness that took years to build. Drayton looked at him. Something shifted in the officer's expression, a brief flicker of recalculation that didn't quite reach his decision-making. "Turn around. Face the vehicle." "I'd strongly recommend you contact your watch commander and verify my identity before—" "I said turn around." Merritt turned. He placed his hands on the roof of the Trailblazer without being told, spreading them flat on the cold, wet metal. He stared at the gate ahead. Gate 5's guard shack was lit up like a lantern, 200 yards of empty approach lane between him and it. He could see the silhouettes of the sentries at post. He wondered if they were watching. Drayton's hand came down on the back of his collar and yanked hard, spinning him around and driving his chest into the roof of the vehicle with enough force to knock the air out of him. The impact sent a spike of white heat through his left shoulder, the same shoulder that had been separated in a Humvee rollover in Ramadi 14 years ago and had never quite gone back to where it started. "You think the ID stunt was clever?" Drayton's voice came from directly behind him, low and close. "People try all kinds of things out here, fake credentials, contractor badges, all kinds of garbage." Merritt kept his hands flat on the roof and said nothing. "What are you really doing out here? You buy something from someone? You selling? You got product in the vehicle?" "I have nothing in the vehicle," Merritt said quietly. "You are on federal property, officer. You crossed the boundary line. I need you to contact your supervisor." The grip on his collar tightened. Drayton leaned in close. "You don't tell me where I am." "Then contact the gate," Merritt said. "Have them verify my identity. That's all I'm asking." "What I'm going to do," Drayton said, stepping back and pulling his handcuffs from his belt, "is take you in for DUI, failure to obey a lawful order, and resisting. We'll sort out the rest downtown. I have not been drinking. I have not resisted, and you are making a catastrophic mistake." The cuffs went on hard. Drayton cinched them down past comfortable, the steel edge biting into the skin above Merritt's wrist bone with a deliberate pressure that had nothing to do with necessity. He spun Merritt around and shoved him against the side of the Trailblazer. "Last time I checked," Drayton said, his voice dropping to something almost conversational, "a man in a beat-up truck with Georgia plates and a fake badge card doesn't give orders." There was a word after that. A single word. The kind that carries the whole weight of a particular history in this country. The kind that men like Drayton deploy, not because they've thought about it, but because it's so deeply grooved into the muscle of contempt that it comes out reflexively when everything else fails. Drayton said it quietly, like it was just a descriptor, like it was just part of a sentence. Merritt went absolutely still. Not from fear, from something far colder. He had been called that word before. The first time he was 14, on a street corner in Macon, Georgia. The last time was in a forward operating base in Helmand Province, by a subordinate who had been removed from his command within the hour. In between those two moments, he had spent 26 years building something in himself that did not bend to that word, did not break, did not answer it with rage, because rage was what men like Drayton were counting on. Rage gave them what they needed. He had learned to give them nothing. He stared straight ahead at the gate. At Gate 5, Lance Corporal Yolanda Fitch was 17 months into her posting as a gate sentry, and she ran a tight post. She logged every vehicle, tracked every credential, flagged every irregularity. She did this not out of ambition, but out of a specific philosophy she'd developed somewhere in the third week of her deployment here, that the gate was the perimeter, and the perimeter was the job, and the job was everything. She'd noticed the police lights activate about 200 yards back and logged it as a possible traffic stop on the approach lane. Standard procedure was observation and logging unless the situation developed inside the boundary line. She picked up her binoculars and looked. The Trailblazer was parked past the yellow line. The police cruiser was parked behind it, and from what she could see in the spill of the cruiser's light bar, the cop's rear bumper was straddling the line itself. She adjusted the focus ring and looked at the driver. She held her breath. Lance Corporal Yolanda Fitch had stood at attention in the base commander's review formation 6 weeks ago when Colonel Merritt had walked the line personally to inspect the gate sentries. She had looked at his face from 18 inches away while he spoke to her about the boundary demarcation protocol. She remembered his voice. She remembered his eyes. She lowered the binoculars and turned to the guard shack. "Sergeant," she said. Staff Sergeant Alvaro Kemp looked up from his log. He heard something in her voice that made him stand up. "PD has a man in cuffs on the approach lane," Fitch said, and her voice was completely steady, which somehow made it worse. "The vehicle is past the yellow line. Sir, I think the man in cuffs is Colonel Merritt." Kemp crossed to the window in 2 strides, raised his own binoculars, and looked. 3 seconds. That was all he needed. He was already reaching for the radio when he said, "Get me the QRF and the PM's office, right now. Code red, Gate 5, code red." Fitch was already moving. She hit the emergency communications panel and picked up the direct line to the provost marshal's duty officer while Kemp was still on the radio with the quick reaction force station. The guard shack became, in the space of about 45 seconds, the most active small space on the entire installation. Outside, Drayton had Merritt by the arm and was steering him toward the back of the cruiser. Merritt moved with him. He didn't resist and didn't comply passively either. He walked, a controlled, deliberate pace, his cuffed hands behind his back, watching the gate from the corner of his eye. He knew the protocol. He'd written parts of it. If the sentries had identified him, the clock had already started. His job right now was to stay calm, stay upright, and not give Drayton anything that could be twisted into a justification. "You have one more opportunity to verify my identity," Merritt said as Drayton opened the rear door of the cruiser. "After this point, the situation stops being a misunderstanding and becomes a federal incident." Drayton grabbed the top of Merritt's head and pushed it down, the standard technique for guiding a suspect into a rear seat, with a force that was neither necessary nor incidental. It was instructive. It was meant to diminish. Merritt's head cleared the door frame. The plastic-lined back seat was inches away. Then the ground moved. Not dramatically, not like an earthquake, but a deep mechanical vibration that came up through the asphalt and into the soles of your feet. Drayton felt it and straightened up, looking around with the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he cannot immediately categorize. Then the sound arrived, a blaring, wailing alarm that split the night air with the kind of volume that was not designed for civilian ears. Drayton turned. The steel delta barriers, 4 reinforced plates, each capable of stopping an explosive-laden truck at 60 miles an hour, were erupting from the asphalt directly in front of his cruiser. They rose smoothly and terrifyingly, like something prehistoric coming up from the earth. At the same time, the heavy steel gates of Gate 5 slammed shut across the exit lanes, the mechanical clang of them audible even over the alarm. The guard tower flood snapped on, halogen arrays that hit the scene with the intensity of stadium lighting, turning the misty coastal night into something close to noon. Drayton stumbled backward. His hand went to his radio instinctively, then he grabbed for his weapon, then stopped, staring around with the wide, unfocused eyes of a man whose entire operating framework had just been forcibly updated. Merritt straightened up from the cruiser door. He did not get in. He turned slowly and looked at the barrier field, then at the guard towers, then at the gate, where even from this distance he could see the guard shack alive with activity. He didn't smile, but something in the set of his jaw shifted slightly, the faint muscle memory of a man who has seen, many times, the moment when a calculated tactical position becomes a decisive one. "That," Merritt said quietly, "is the base going to full perimeter lockdown." Drayton stared at him. "What?" "It means my Marines have identified me," Merritt said, "and they're coming." He was right. From the direction of the interior road that ran parallel to the perimeter fence, the sound of heavy diesel engines was growing. Fast. 3 armored MP vehicles came around the service bend and hit their brakes 20 yards behind the deployed barriers, their red and blue lights adding to the already chaotic visual landscape. The doors flew open before the vehicles fully stopped. 8 military police Marines in full tactical gear, Kevlar vests, ballistic helmets, M4 carbines at the low ready, poured out and moved into a textbook wedge formation, advancing toward the police cruiser with a synchronized efficiency that made the whole thing look like a demonstration. Leading them was a compact, sharp-faced officer whose jaw was working in a way that suggested a concentrated internal fury. Captain Renata Voss, Provost Marshal Duty Officer, Harmon Installation. She'd been on a conference call reviewing next month's training schedule when the code red hit her radio, and she had come out of her office at a controlled sprint. She had the dossier on Colonel Merritt memorized not because it was required, but because she made it her business to know the commanding officer's personnel history. When the radio call told her a local cop had him in cuffs on the approach lane, she had experienced a very brief, very specific moment of complete disbelief, followed immediately by an engine-red focus that had not cooled on the 2-minute drive to the gate. She raised the megaphone as her Marines fanned out around the cruiser. "Pelican Bluffs police officer." Her voice came through the megaphone with a flat, hard clarity. "Step away from the individual in custody. Keep your hands clearly visible. Step back from the vehicle. You are operating outside your jurisdictional authority and in violation of federal law." Drayton looked at her. He looked at the rifles. He looked at the laser sights that had appeared on the hood of his cruiser like a dozen red fireflies. His mouth opened and closed once. "Back off!" His voice cracked at the top. "This is a local police matter. This man is under arrest. I'm transporting him to the precinct." Every Marine raised their weapon. The safety selectors clicked in sequence, a sound so specific and so loaded that it reached something old and animal in Drayton's chest and squeezed it hard. Voss stepped forward, drawing her own sidearm and stopping at the yellow line. "If you touch your firearm on a federal installation, you will be treated as a hostile threat," she said, the megaphone gone, just her voice, and it carried. "Take your hand off your belt. Do it slowly." Drayton's hand moved away from his holster. His arms came up, trembling slightly at the elbows, and the sweat on his face caught the floodlights in a way that made him look very young and very exposed. "Uncuff him," Voss said. "Now." Drayton's hand shook so badly that he dropped the key on the first attempt. It hit the asphalt. He crouched, retrieved it, straightened, and approached Merritt with the wooden movements of a man walking to something he cannot avoid. He inserted the key. The cuff sprang open with a flat click. Merritt brought his arms forward, rolled his wrist twice, and looked at the red marks above the bones without expression. He turned to face Voss. Voss snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. Behind her, all 8 Marines did the same in a single motion. 8 sets of fingers at 8 brows, rifles lowered, posture rigid, in the blinding light and the wailing alarms and the damp coastal air. Merritt returned the salute with his right hand. The motion was entirely steady. "Stand down," he said. "Captain, secure the officer. Confiscate his equipment. He's to be held in the PM's holding facility pending formal processing." He paused. "Then get me the Pelican Bluffs chief of police on the phone, tonight." Voss dropped her salute. "Sir." She turned to her Marines and gave a tight hand signal. 2 of them stepped forward and took Drayton by the arms with a grip that left no room for interpretation. Drayton's mouth worked again. "You can't. I'm a law enforcement officer. You can't." "You're a federal detainee," Voss said flatly. "Walk." They stripped his duty belt, weapon, radio, cuffs, baton, right there on the approach lane, treating it like evidence rather than equipment, because that was what it was now. As they walked him toward the armored vehicle, Drayton looked back over his shoulder. He looked at Merritt. Merritt was not looking at him. He was looking at the gate, at the guard shack, at the young lance corporal visible through the glass who was still on the communications console and had not stopped working from the moment she'd raised those binoculars. He looked at the barrier field, the deployed steel, the floodlights still cutting the fog into bright sections. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at a system he built, when the system does exactly what it was designed to do. Voss appeared at his shoulder. "Sir, are you injured?" "My shoulder will be stiff tomorrow," he said. It was already going to be stiff tomorrow. He paused. "The gate sentry. Who made the initial identification?" "Lance Corporal Fitch, sir. She's the one who called it in." He nodded once. He would remember that name. "The chief of police," he said. "Tonight, Captain." "Already dialing, sir." He turned and looked once more at the empty highway beyond the barrier field. The road was dark and slick and deserted. The patrol car sat with its light bar still running, painting the fog red and blue in rotating arcs. And it looked, from where he stood, very small. He turned toward the gate, toward the installation, and walked. Behind him, in the rear of an armored Marine Corps MP vehicle, Kyle Drayton sat with his hands in his lap, and his badge gone, and his weapon gone, and his radio gone, listening to the sirens he had heard his whole career from the other side, and understanding for the first time, with a cold and sinking certainty, that the story he had written in his head tonight was not the story that was actually happening. The vehicle doors closed, and the locks engaged. The locks on the armored vehicle engaging was the last sound Kyle Drayton heard before the world outside became muffled and strange, filtered through half-inch ballistic glass, and the dull roar of a diesel engine pulling away from the approach lane. He sat in the rear compartment with his back against the hard polymer wall and his hands in his lap, and nothing on his belt but the belt itself. And he stared at the floor because looking at the 2 MPs seated across from him, helmets on, rifles between their knees, expressions somewhere between bored and disgusted, was worse than looking at the floor. He had been in the back of police vehicles before. He'd transported enough suspects to know exactly what it felt like from the front seat, the control of it, the clarity of roles. From back here, with someone else's locks engaged and someone else's route being driven, it felt like a completely different piece of machinery, which, he was beginning to understand, it was. Nobody spoke to him. That was the part that got under his skin fastest. He'd expected yelling, or at least the hard official tone of someone reading him his rights. Instead, there was just the engine and the tires on wet asphalt, and the two Marines who looked at him the way you look at something that fell off a shelf and needs to be dealt with before you can go back to what you were doing. The vehicle stopped. A door opened. A hand, not rough, just present and unarguable, guided him out by the elbow into a lit corridor inside a low concrete building that smelled of industrial cleaner and recycled air. I was photographed, documented, and placed in a holding room that was not a cell in the traditional sense but had the same essential logic: 4 walls, a bench, a door that locked from the outside. His watch was still on his wrist. His phone was not. They'd taken that along with everything else. He sat down on the bench. The fluorescent tube above him buzzed with a frequency that seemed designed specifically to prevent comfort. He sat there and thought about calling his uncle. Then remembered his phone was gone. Then thought about what he would say anyway, and found that the words he'd always assumed were there. The explanations, the justifications, were not forming the way he expected. The story he'd been building in his head during the drive, the one where he'd been doing his job and the whole thing had been an unfortunate overreach, was meeting something harder than it could handle. The specific memory of what he'd said on that approach lane, the word he'd used, the way he'd put his hand on the back of that man's head and pushed down. He was still trying to find a version of events that didn't include those two things when the door at the end of the corridor opened and boots clicked on the linoleum. 3 miles from the installation's front gate, in a development of newer homes built on the inland side of the coastal hills, Chief of Police Warren Grable was asleep with a book still open on his chest when his cell phone went off on the nightstand. He'd made it to page 40 of a naval history he'd been trying to finish for 4 months, and sleep had taken him mid-paragraph the way it always did when he lay down after 10, which was most nights. He answered on the second ring out of 26 years of muscle memory. The voice on the other end was his night watch commander, and what the watch commander said caused Grable to sit up very quickly, put his feet on the floor, and say nothing for about 15 seconds. "Say that again," he said finally. The watch commander said it again. Grable stood up and went to the closet. He dressed while the watch commander was still talking, which was not something he typically did during phone calls because he valued the discipline of full attention. But his hands needed something to do, and the act of dressing was familiar enough to run on its own. "Who was the officer?" "Drayton, sir. Kyle Drayton." Grable stopped moving for a moment. He closed his eyes, opened them, put on his shoe. "And the man he detained?" "Colonel Darius Merritt, sir. Commanding officer, Harmon Installation." Another pause. Grable put on the second shoe. "Where's Drayton now?" "PM holding facility, sir. On base. They have him." "And what are the charges they're processing?" The watch commander listed them. Grable listened to all of them without interrupting, which was harder than it sounds because with every charge the list got longer and each addition carried its own specific weight, and by the end of it there was a heaviness in his chest that he recognized as the particular dread that comes not from surprise but from confirmation. He had seen Kyle Drayton's file. He had read the complaints. He had watched 3 separate supervisors flag the same patterns in writing and then watched those flags get quietly set aside by a phone call from an office 2 floors above Grable's head. Senator Arthur Drayton's office. Arthur, who had been making Kyle's career path smooth since before Kyle was old enough to shave. "I'm on my way," Grable said. "Tell them I'm coming, and do not call the senator's office tonight. That call doesn't happen without me in the room." He hung up, stood in his bedroom in the dark for a moment, then picked up his keys and went out. Merritt had showered, changed into his service alphas, and was sitting behind his desk in the command building CO suite by the time Grable's car was escorted through the visitor gate. The uniform had been his decision, deliberate and considered. He was not performing authority. He was making a structural fact visible. The gold eagles on his collar were not decorative. The 4 rows of ribbons on his chest were not for show. Every single one of them was a notation in a very long record, and tonight that record was relevant. Captain Voss stood to his right. She had pulled Drayton's full personnel file and the installation's own incident log for the Gate 5 approach zone, and she'd placed both in a neat stack to the left of Merritt's desk without being asked. She'd also pulled the Sentinel surveillance archive and confirmed that all 4 camera feeds, infrared thermal, license plate reader, overhead drone, and high-definition audio-video, had captured continuous, uninterrupted footage of the entire incident. She'd done all of this in the 40 minutes between the lockdown and now, which told Merritt something about Voss that he'd already suspected. The door opened. Chief Grabble came in flanked by a single aide who looked young enough to be a first year, and to his credit, Grabble did not extend his hand or open with pleasantries. He walked to the chair across from the desk and sat down, which was the right move, and looked at Merritt directly, which was also the right move. "Colonel," Grabble said, "I'm here." "Chief?" Merritt looked at him evenly. "Before we talk about how this ends, I want to establish what actually happened. I'm not interested in your interpretation or mine until we've looked at the same evidence." Grabble nodded. His face was the face of a man who had already done some internal accounting on the drive over and did not love the numbers. Voss brought up the Sentinel feeds on the wall monitor without preamble. She ran the footage in sequence, the plate reader showing Merritt's speed and lane position, flawless, not a single deviation. The overhead drone showing the exact moment Drayton's cruiser parked with its rear bumper across the painted yellow line, clear as a diagram. The infrared thermal showing brake heat on the Trailblazer consistent with a slow, deliberate stop. Not a pursuit, not an evasion, not a man trying to escape anything. And then the audio-visual, the guard shack's directional microphone, which had picked up the approach lane with a clarity that was almost surgical. They heard Drayton's voice. They heard what Drayton said. They heard the specific word that Drayton used. Grabble's aide looked at his notepad. His pen had stopped moving about 30 seconds into the audio feed and hadn't started again. Grable himself sat with his hands folded in his lap and said nothing until the footage ended. Then he said, "How many copies of this exist?" "Enough," Voss said. Grable exhaled. It was a long breath, the kind that carries a lot of weight on the way out. "Colonel, I'm not going to tell you this was a misunderstanding, because it wasn't. I'm not going to tell you Drayton is a good officer who made a bad call, because that's not accurate either." He paused. "I'm going to tell you that there are factors in this situation that extend beyond my desk, and I think you probably already know what they are." "The senator," Merritt said. "His nephew." "Yes." Merritt folded his hands on the desk. "I know about Senator Arthur Drayton. I know about the flag that went on Kyle Drayton's psychological evaluation before he was hired. I know about the 2 complaint files that were administratively closed after calls from the senator's office. My legal staff spent 40 minutes pulling records that took them about 12 minutes to find, which means they weren't hidden very well." Grable looked like he wanted to say something and decided against it. "What I want from you tonight," Merritt continued, "is straightforward. Drayton gets formally transferred to FBI custody for civil rights violations. Not departmental review, not internal discipline. Federal custody. The FBI field office in San Diego has already been notified. They're aware of the situation. I want a joint review of every arrest Drayton has made in the Gate 5 perimeter corridor in the last 3 years. And I want that process led by the DOJ, not your office." Grable was quiet for a moment. "And if I push back on the federal custody piece?" Merritt looked at him. "Then Captain Voss walks out of this building tonight with a copy of that audio-visual feed and the contact information for every major news network with a bureau between here and Washington. And we have a very different conversation tomorrow morning." He paused. "I'd prefer not to do that, Chief. I don't think you would either." Grable looked at the monitor. The feed had ended, but the last frame, Drayton's cruiser sitting squarely across the painted yellow line, its light bar still running, was still on the screen. He looked at it for a long moment. "No," he said, "I wouldn't." He stood. He didn't offer his hand, and Merritt didn't stand to meet him. "I'll need to make a call." "You have the room next door," Voss said. "Take as long as you need." Grable walked out. His aide followed, and the door closed behind them. The suite was quiet for a moment. Merritt reached for the cup of coffee on his desk. Black, gone cold, poured 40 minutes ago and forgotten, and drank some of it anyway. Voss watched him without comment. "Good work tonight, Captain." "I had help, sir. Fitch deserves the credit for the initial ID." "I know." He set the cup down. "I'll talk to her tomorrow." He looked at the monitor. The frozen frame of the cruiser sitting on the yellow line. Get some rest after this. You've got the morning brief at 07. Voss almost smiled. Almost. Understood, sir. Well, the call that Grabble made from the adjacent room lasted 22 minutes. When he came back in, his face had the specific flatness of a man who had just had a conversation he will not describe and does not intend to. He confirmed what Merritt had asked for. All of it. FBI custody, DOJ review, the works. He said it in the tone of a man reading from a document he didn't write, and Merritt accepted it the same way. Without satisfaction, without warmth, just the clean acknowledgement of terms agreed to. Grable left before midnight. His aide hadn't written anything since the audio feed. What Merritt didn't know yet, what was unfolding in a wood-paneled office 45 minutes north in a town called Caris Point, where the senator kept his district residence, was that Arthur Drayton had already been woken up by a call from his chief of staff, who had gotten a call from someone in Grabble's department who had not followed Grabble's explicit instruction, and who would regret that decision in a few weeks when the DOJ's review scope expanded. Senator Drayton was 63 years old, had been in state politics for 22 years, and had survived things that would have ended careers twice over. He was not a man who panicked, but he was also not a man who'd ever had his nephew handcuffed inside a military installation while an unedited surveillance feed of the whole thing sat on a federal server. He told his chief of staff to get him a legal contact at the Pentagon's Congressional Liaison Office. He was told, politely and definitively, that the Pentagon's Congressional Liaison Office was not available for that kind of call at this hour, and that given the nature of the incident, it was unlikely to be available for that kind of call at any hour in the near future. He told his chief of staff to try someone else. The chief of staff spent 30 minutes trying. Each door that opened closed again as soon as the details were relayed. The senator sat in his study with a bourbon he wasn't drinking and looked at the framed photographs on the wall. Himself with 3 different governors. Himself with the Secretary of State at a fundraiser. Himself at the opening of a veterans memorial that his office had helped fund. He was good at veterans memorials. I was good at the official version of support for the troops, the ribbon cutting and the budget allocation and the careful quotable statements. He had never actually thought very hard about what the troops were like, what a man who commanded 12,000 of them might be capable of when pushed. He was starting to think about it now. By 3 in the morning, the holding room off the PM's corridor had gotten no more comfortable. Drayton had given up trying to organize his thoughts into anything coherent, and had simply settled into a state of suspended dread, sitting on the bench with his back against the wall and his eyes on the door. His shoulder ached from where he'd wrenched it, reaching for the handcuff key. He was very thirsty and had not asked for water because asking for anything felt like it would cost something he couldn't afford. The door opened at 3:12. It was not a Marine this time. It was a man in his mid-40s in civilian clothes, a dark jacket, no tie, a bearing that was not military but was something adjacent to it. He was carrying a thin folder and a coffee cup, and he set the coffee on the bench beside Drayton without ceremony and sat in the single chair across from him. "I'm Special Agent Frank Tulin," the man said, "FBI Civil Rights Division, San Diego Field Office." He opened the folder. "I'm not here to arrest you tonight. I'm here because we're going to be spending a lot of time together in the coming weeks, and I prefer to start conversations early." He looked at Drayton. "Do you have legal representation?" Drayton stared at him. "My uncle is a state senator with no jurisdiction over a federal investigation," Tulin said. Not unkindly, but without any cushion. "Do you have a lawyer, Mr. Drayton?" The way he said Mr. Drayton landed differently than Kyle had expected. Not aggressive, just accurate. The title that applied now. "No," Drayton said. Tulin nodded. "We'll get you a federal public defender in the morning. Tonight, I just want you to understand what the process looks like." He turned a page in the folder. "We're going to review your record. All of it. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every use of force report you filed in 3 years. We're going to look at the ones that settled quietly and the ones that didn't make it to paper at all. We're going to talk to people." He looked up. "Some of those people have been waiting for someone to ask." Drayton said nothing. "The surveillance footage from the installation is complete and continuous," Tulin continued. 4 independent cameras, audio included. "There's no version of tonight that we're working from that doesn't include all of that." He paused. "Now, I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer, but I'd like you to actually think about it before you decide." He leaned forward slightly. Is there anything in your record that you would want us to hear from you first, rather than from the files? The fluorescent tube buzzed. Drayton looked at the coffee cup beside him. It was still steaming. He thought about the stops. The ones that had gone the way tonight had gone, more or less, minus the military base and the surveillance cameras and the colonel who knew the protocol better than he did. The ones he'd written up as routine and which had felt, at the time, like doing his job. He thought about the faces of the people he'd pulled out of cars on the Gate 5 corridor at night, young men mostly, in the kinds of vehicles young men on a junior enlisted salary could afford, and what he'd assumed about those vehicles and those men before he ever ran a plate. He reached for the coffee cup. His hand was still shaking slightly. "I want a lawyer first," he said. Tulin nodded, closed the folder, stood up. "That's the right answer," he said. Not warmly, just professionally. "Get some sleep, Mr. Drayton. Tomorrow starts early." He walked out. The door locked again. Morning came through the single high window of the holding room as a rectangle of gray coastal light that moved slowly across the floor. Drayton watched it move for a while, which was all there was to do. He'd slept in fitful 30-minute pieces, jolting awake each time boots passed in the corridor, then lying back down on the bench and staring at the ceiling until the next round. At 6:40, the corridor door opened again, and he heard multiple sets of feet. He sat up. The door to his holding room swung open. 3 people stood in the frame: Agent Tulin, a uniformed Marine MP, and a woman Drayton had not seen before, small and precisely dressed in a dark blazer, with a leather portfolio under one arm, and the expression of someone who has been working since before the building's lights came on. "This is Major Elise Carver," Tulin said. "She's the installation's JAG officer. She's here to ensure the transfer of custody is documented correctly." Carver stepped forward and held out a document. "Mr. Drayton, this is the formal transfer of custody notification. You're being moved from PM holding to federal custody effective this morning. I need you to confirm receipt." Drayton looked at the document. His name was on it, and beneath his name were the charges, and seeing them printed on official paper in a format he recognized from his own professional life, because he had filled out forms not unlike this one on the other side of the process, made something in his chest go airless. He took the document. His fingers left a slight dampness on the edge of the paper. "Sign at the bottom," Carver said. "This isn't a plea, it's a receipt." He signed. His handwriting looked unfamiliar to him, cramped and uneven in a way it wasn't when he was the one holding authority in a room. Tulin handed him a set of civilian clothes, jeans, a gray sweatshirt. "Change out of the uniform shirt," he said. "You don't get to wear the badge you don't have anymore." They gave him privacy for that, which was almost worse. A small, deliberate courtesy in a situation built entirely from the absence of courtesy, and it made the contrast sharp enough to feel like an accusation. When the door opened again and they walked him out through the corridor and into the thin morning light of the installation service road, Drayton squinted in the gray brightness and breathed the salt air and looked around at the base, the long flat buildings, the motor pool, the distant guard towers, with the specific disorientation of a man on unfamiliar ground who cannot locate a single landmark that belongs to him. At the end of the service road, a dark sedan was parked alongside one of the armored MP vehicles. Standing near the command building's side entrance, in pressed combat utilities, was Colonel Darius Merritt. Drayton saw him from 50 yards away. He didn't stop walking. The hand on his elbow kept him moving at a steady pace. But his eyes went to Merritt and stayed there across the distance. Merritt watched them come. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his weight even on both feet, and he looked at Drayton the way you look at a structural failure. Not with anger, because anger is personal, but with the focused attention of someone cataloging exactly where the thing gave way and why, so that it doesn't happen again. They were 20 yards apart when Drayton's step faltered. Not a stop, more a catch, a stumble in the rhythm of his walk that the MP beside him absorbed without comment. "Colonel," Drayton started. Merritt said nothing. The hand on Drayton's elbow kept him moving. The distance closed to 10 yards, then 5, and then they were level with each other on the service road, and Merritt's eyes tracked Drayton the whole way past without his head moving and without his expression changing, and that stillness, that complete and absolute stillness, was the most unsettling thing Drayton had experienced in 36 hours that had not been short on unsettling things. The sedan's rear door opened. Drayton was guided in. The door closed. Merritt watched the vehicle pull away, turn at the end of the service road, and disappear behind the motor pool building. The engine sound faded. The morning was quiet except for the distant rhythm of the ocean and the mechanical hum of the bass coming to life around him. Vehicles starting, boots on pavement, the distant call of a formation run. He turned and walked back toward the command building. He had a 07 brief in 11 minutes, and his shoulder was stiffer than he'd expected. Inside his office, his desk held the cold remnants of last night's coffee, a stack of operational reports he hadn't touched, and the Sentinel footage archive that Voss had printed a summary of at some point in the early hours. He picked up the summary and read the first page. At the bottom, in Voss's handwriting, efficient, barely legible, was a note. Fitch on day shift 0800. Recommend commendation review. He set the summary down and picked up the cold coffee. He was mid-sip when his phone rang. The number on the screen was one he recognized, the office of State Senator Arthur Drayton, the call he'd been expecting since last night and had been giving the senator time to work up to. He looked at the number. He let it ring 4 times. Then he picked up. "Senator," he said, "I've been waiting for this call." The voice on the other end was controlled, but only in the way that pressure-tested things are controlled. The containment audible in every syllable. The strain of a man working very hard not to let anything show that he can't afford to show. "Colonel Merritt, I think there's been a significant overreaction on the part of your command, and I'd like the opportunity to discuss—" "Senator," Merritt said, and his voice had the quality of a room going quiet. "I want you to understand something very clearly before we continue. This conversation is being recorded per standard protocol. Everything said in this call becomes part of the federal record." A pause. Very brief. "I understand." "Good." Merritt set his coffee down. "Then let me tell you what I told your chief of police last night. This is not a misunderstanding. It is not an overreaction. Your nephew used a racial slur against a commissioned officer of the United States Marine Corps on federal property. He fabricated a charge of driving under the influence. He assaulted a federal officer and attempted to remove him from the installation by force. All of this happened on camera, Senator. 4 cameras, audio included." The line was quiet. "The FBI has custody of your nephew. The DOJ is opening a review of his full arrest record. That review is not something I can stop, and it's not something you can stop either. What you can control," Merritt said, "is what you do in the next 24 hours. If you come out publicly in support of your nephew, you will be publicly defending a man whose misconduct is documented in federal-grade surveillance footage that will be available to any news organization that files a request." He paused. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about that." Another silence. Longer this time. When the senator spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. A subtle change in register, the sound of a man who has finished calculating and doesn't like the result. "What is it you want, Colonel?" "I already have what I want," Merritt said. "I want you to understand that this installation and the Marines who serve here are not a constituency you can manage. They are not a budget line you can threaten. And the next time one of your political appointments ends up in my perimeter—" He stopped. Waited a beat. "There won't be a next time," the senator said quietly. It wasn't a concession. It was something more resigned than that. It was the sound of a man understanding, for perhaps the first time, the specific and unmanageable weight of what his nephew had kicked awake in the dark. "No," Merritt said, "there won't." He hung up. Outside his window, the morning formation run was passing, 200 Marines in loose columns, boots hitting the road in that imperfect unified rhythm that is nothing like a march and everything like something alive. He watched them for a moment, the gray light catching the movement of it. His phone rang again. Different number this time. He looked at it. It was the San Diego field office of the FBI. Not Tulin, someone above Tulin, a name he recognized from the Pentagon briefings on federal civil rights enforcement frameworks. Someone who had, apparently, been reviewing the dossier Voss transmitted at 2 in the morning and had thoughts. He answered. "Special Agent Reyes," he said. The voice on the other end was brisk and direct in a way he respected immediately. "Colonel Merritt, I've reviewed the Sentinel footage and the initial charge documentation. We're moving forward on the federal civil rights case, and I want to loop you in on something that came up in our preliminary records pull. She paused, and the pause had weight. Drayton's arrest record in the Gate 5 corridor goes back further than 3 years. We're finding activity in his first 6 months on the job that his department didn't log as use-of-force incidents, but that the subjects filed informal complaints about. Those complaints were reviewed internally and dismissed, all of them. Merritt was quiet. We're pulling the names of the complainants, Reyes continued. Some of them are going to be your Marines, Colonel. And when we interview them, this is going to get significantly larger than one incident on one night. He stood up from his desk, walked to the window. The formation run had passed and the road was empty again. How much larger? He asked. That, Reyes said, is what I'm calling to tell you we don't know yet. Another pause. But I think you should prepare your legal staff for extended cooperation. This is going to take time. He looked out at the road, at the base stretching away from him in both directions. The barracks, the motor pool, the distant shimmer of the ocean past the tree line. 12,000 people living and working inside this perimeter. Driving off this base at night into the corridor where Drayton had been running his own private operation for 3 years, maybe longer. Whatever you need from us, Merritt said, we'll be here. Good. Reyes's voice had something in it now, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. Colonel, I've read your service record. I'm sorry this happened to you. He thought about that for a moment. About the word sorry, about what it was being offered for, about the gap between what the word covered and what the night had actually contained. Don't be sorry for me, he said. Be thorough. He hung up. Set the phone on the windowsill. Stood looking at the road. He was still standing there when Voss knocked twice and came in with the 07 brief documents and the news that Senator Drayton's office had issued a statement 40 minutes ago, apparently drafted sometime in the pre-dawn hours, before the senator had even made his call to Merritt. The statement did not defend Kyle Drayton. It did not mention the installation or the incident. It said, in 4 careful sentences, that the senator was deeply troubled by the conduct that had been brought to his attention, that accountability was paramount, and that he would be cooperating fully with any relevant investigations. Merritt read it twice. Voss watched him. Sir? He handed the document back to her. He made the calculation, he said. Faster than I expected, she said. He's been making calculations for 22 years, Merritt said. He's good at it. He picked up the brief documents from her other hand. 07, Captain. Let's go. They walked out. The corridor was bright and busy with the ordinary machinery of a base morning. NCOs carrying reports, a logistics specialist arguing with a printer in the far office, someone's boots squeaking on the linoleum in the measured rhythm of someone who is late and knows it. Ordinary. All of it terrifyingly ordinary. Which was exactly what it was supposed to be, and which Kyle Drayton, riding north in the back of a federal sedan toward a processing facility in San Diego, had no part in anymore. But 2 hours later, when Merritt was deep in the 07 brief and the day was beginning to take shape around him, a message came through on the secure terminal from Agent Reyes's office. It was brief, 3 sentences. A name had surfaced in the preliminary record pull. A Marine. A corporal from the 2nd Battalion who had filed an informal complaint 14 months ago after a Gate 5 stop that had ended with a broken wrist and a disorderly conduct charge that had never made it past the desk of the watch commander, whose job had just become significantly more precarious. The corporal's name was Yolanda Fitch. The message sat on the secure terminal for 11 seconds before Merritt read it a second time. He was not a man who reread things. He had trained himself out of that habit in his first year as a battalion commander, when the volume of incoming information made rereading a luxury that cost time he didn't have. But he read this one twice, because the first pass produced a result his brain rejected on instinct. Yolanda Fitch, Corporal, 2nd Battalion, informal complaint, 14 months ago. Gate 5 corridor, broken wrist, disorderly conduct charge dismissed. He looked up from the terminal. Voss was standing at the far end of the conference table with the 07 brief materials still in her hands, watching his face. Sir? He turned the terminal toward her. She crossed the room and read it. Her jaw tightened in a way that was barely visible and very specific, the expression of someone absorbing something they find professionally intolerable. She's on day shift, Voss said. She's at the gate right now. I know. She never filed a formal complaint. I know that too. He stood up. The stiffness in his shoulder had settled into a dull background presence he was learning to ignore. The 07 brief is postponed. Get Major Carver, get Agent Reyes's local contact, and find me a room that isn't this one. He picked up his cover. Then go to Gate 5 and relieve Fitch from post. Tell her it's administrative. Don't tell her anything else yet. Voss was already moving. Sir, how do you want to handle the disorderly conduct charge? It's in her service jacket. It's in her jacket because someone put it there, Merritt said. We'll handle it. He said it with a flatness that didn't invite further questions. Voss didn't ask any. The room Voss found was a small conference space 2 doors down from the PM's office, the kind of institutional room that exists in every military building. A table, chairs, a whiteboard with something from a previous meeting half erased, a single window looking onto the motor pool. When Fitch arrived, she was in her full-duty uniform, her rifle already signed over to the incoming sentry at the gate, her posture the kind of careful straight that comes from not knowing why you've been called somewhere. She stood at attention when Merritt entered. At ease, Corporal, he said. Sit down. She sat. She was 20 years old. Merritt had known she was young, but sitting across from her in a small room in the flat morning light, he was reminded of how young 20 actually was. The particular combination of visible competence and invisible fragility that the Marines worked very hard to shape into something durable, with varying success. He sat across from her. He put no documents on the table. He didn't open a folder. He just looked at her. 14 months ago, he said, you were stopped in the Gate 5 corridor by Officer Kyle Drayton. You filed an informal complaint with the Pelican Bluffs PD Watch Commander's office. The complaint was dismissed. A disorderly conduct charge was entered in your service jacket that was also subsequently dismissed, but the entry remained. He paused. I want to hear what happened. In your own words, starting where it started. Fitch looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. Her eyes were steady, but something around the corners of them was working harder than the rest of her face. I was coming back from a weekend pass, sir, about 11:30 at night. My registration was current. Everything was current. She stopped, started again. He pulled me over about a quarter mile from the gate. I had my military ID ready. He didn't want it. He said my brake lights were intermittent, which they weren't. Another pause. He asked me to step out of the vehicle. I did. He ran his hands along the door frame of my car, said he was doing a plain view search. She stopped again. Merritt waited. He grabbed my wrist when I asked him to explain his probable cause, she said. He twisted it. I went down. He said I'd struck him, which I hadn't, and he called it in as a resisting charge. She looked at the table again. The base medical officer documented a hairline fracture of the distal radius. Drayton's report said I'd fallen. The room was quiet. Why didn't you file a formal complaint? Merritt asked. Not accusatory, just asking. I was told... She stopped, corrected her phrasing. My platoon sergeant at the time told me that formal complaints against local PD required a JAG review and that the review could take up to 6 months, and that during that period my security clearance application would be an administrative hold. She folded her hands on the table. I was 3 weeks from submitting my clearance application, sir. Merritt looked at her. He thought about what it meant, what it cost, to make that calculation at 20 years old, alone in a room with a form in front of you and 6 months of your career sitting on one side of a scale. He thought about how many people had made that same calculation alone in rooms nobody was paying attention to. Your platoon sergeant was wrong about the hold requirement, he said. A formal civil complaint does not trigger administrative hold on a clearance application. That's not how the process works. She absorbed that. He watched her absorb it. The specific way a person processes being told that the obstacle that shaped a year of their life was not real. No, sir, she said quietly. I found that out later. He nodded. I'm going to have Major Carver begin the process of having that disorderly conduct notation formally expunged from your service jacket. It will be gone before the end of the week. He paused. The FBI is conducting a review of Drayton's arrest record in this corridor going back 3 years. They're going to want a formal statement from you. You don't have to give one. I want to, she said. Fast. The speed of it was the most unguarded thing she'd done in the room. She caught herself and steadied. Sir, I want to give a statement. He looked at her for a moment. 20 years old. Hairline fracture of the distal radius, clearance application in hand, choosing the path that cost her the least and probably haunted her longest. All right, he said. Agent Reyes's team will contact you today. He stood. She started to stand. Sit down, Corporal. I have one more thing to say. She sat back down. He remained standing, which was not what she'd expected, and that asymmetry was deliberate. He wanted her to hear this upright. What you did at 0100 this morning, he said, with the binoculars and the radio call, that was the correct action, executed correctly, under conditions that would have made most people hesitate. He paused. I don't take that for granted. My command doesn't take it for granted. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not quite emotion, more the surface tension of something that had been held in a specific position for a long time and was being given permission to move. Dismissed, Corporal, he said. She stood, came to attention, and rendered a salute that was sharp enough to cut something. He returned it and watched her walk out. The door closed behind her. He stood in the conference room alone for a moment. Then he went to find Major Carver. The morning did not stay quiet. By 9:40, Reyes's team had made contact with 4 additional individuals whose names had surfaced in the preliminary records pull. 3 enlisted Marines and 1 civilian contractor who worked the commissary supply chain and lived in the town of Pelican Bluffs proper. All 4 had contact incidents with Drayton in the Gate 5 corridor. None of the 4 had filed formal complaints that were still in any active file. 2 of them had disorderly conduct notations in departmental records that had been used, in both cases, as leverage for quick settlements of what should have been civil suits. By 10:15, the scope of what Reyes's team was uncovering had expanded enough that she called Merritt directly. We're looking at a pattern that goes back further than 3 years, she said. Possibly to Drayton's first year, possibly earlier. We need to widen the records request. What do you need from me? Access to the installation's incident logs for the Gate 5 corridor going back 5 years. Not just the contact reports, all of them. Anytime there was a police interaction in that approach zone that resulted in a call to your PM's office, whether or not it was escalated. You'll have it by noon, Merritt said. Colonel? She paused. Some of what we're finding is going to be uncomfortable for your department too. Incidents that should have triggered a formal response from the installation and didn't. He was quiet for a moment. He'd expected this. A systemic problem never lived only on one side of a boundary line. I know, he said. Whatever you find, you include it. Another pause, shorter this time. Understood. Thank you. He hung up, sat back, looked at the operational calendar on his desk. 3 weeks of scheduled training exercises, a congressional liaison visit at the end of the month, a battalion readiness review. All of it still there, still requiring his attention. The ordinary machinery of a command that did not stop because the commanding officer had spent a night in handcuffs. He pulled the calendar toward him and started making notes. He'd learned a long time ago that the work didn't wait for you to finish being affected by things. By midday, the news had moved. Not officially. Merritt had not held a press briefing. The FBI had released nothing. And the Pelican Bluffs PD's public information officer had issued a one-line statement confirming only that an officer was on administrative leave pending investigation. But the Gate 5 corridor was not a vacuum, and 12,000 Marines talking among themselves produced a current of information that moved faster and more accurately than most official channels. By noon, the 2nd Battalion's common areas had a version of events that was approximately 80% correct, which was a higher accuracy rate than most news cycles managed. By 1400, Merritt's command sergeant major, a 14-year veteran named Burl Taccone, who was shaped like a door and had a voice like something you felt before you heard, appeared in the doorway of the CO's office and stood there until Merritt looked up. Sir, Taccone said, Sergeant Major. The barracks are talking. I know. They're not wrong about what happened. No, Merritt said. They're mostly not. Taccone came in and closed the door behind him, which was a thing he only did when what he was about to say required the door to be closed. He sat down in the chair across the desk, the same chair where Grabel had sat last night, and folded his large hands in his lap. Some of the junior enlisted are talking about organizing something, Taccone said. Not a protest, more like a assembly. They want to do something visible. Tell them no, Merritt said. Taccone nodded. He'd expected that. How do I explain it? Tell them that the most powerful thing they can do right now is keep doing their jobs correctly. That the investigation is underway and it will be thorough, and that the way they honor the people who got hurt in that corridor is by making sure this installation is everything it's supposed to be. He paused. And tell them that their CO is handling it. Taccone looked at him for a moment. They know you are, sir. That's why they want to do something. They feel, he worked at the word, activated. Merritt understood that. He felt it himself, a heat behind the sternum that had been there since the moment the cuffs went on and hadn't entirely cooled. But heat without direction was just fire, and fire in a barracks was a disaster. Activated is useful when it's aimed, Merritt said. Point them at their jobs. Taccone stood. Yes, sir. He moved to the door, then stopped. Without turning, for what it's worth, sir, last night. What you did, keeping it contained, not letting it explode into something uglier than it already was. He paused. That wasn't easy. No, Merritt said. It wasn't. Taccone left. Merritt picked up his pen and went back to the operational calendar. What? The explosion came anyway. It just came from a direction he hadn't been watching. At 15:20, Major Carver appeared in the doorway with a printed document and an expression that Merritt had not seen on her face before. Not alarm, because Carver was not a person who alarmed easily, but a focused, almost clinical tension, the face of someone who has picked up a piece of evidence and recognized exactly what it means. Sir, she said, the DOJ records pull flagged something. We need to look at it now. She placed the document on his desk. He looked at it. It was a court filing, civil, not criminal, filed 8 months ago in the Southern California Federal District Court. A wrongful arrest claim against the Pelican Bluffs PD by a plaintiff named Marcus Webb, 23 years old, corporal, 3rd Battalion, Harmon Installation. The claim alleged false imprisonment following a Gate 5 corridor stop. The claim had been filed by a private attorney and had been assigned to a case docket. Then, 5 months ago, the claim had been dismissed, voluntarily, by the plaintiff. Merritt read that line twice. Why did he drop it? That's what I want you to see. Carver turned the document over. On the back was a copy of a letter, not the original, a photocopy that had the slightly degraded quality of something that had been scanned from a scan. The letterhead was from the office of State Senator Arthur Drayton. The letter was not signed by the senator. It was signed by his chief of staff. It was addressed to the plaintiff's attorney and contained in carefully indirect language a reference to the attorney's pending application for a position on the State Judicial Nomination Review Committee, a position that was, the letter noted, currently under consideration by the senator's office. That's a threat, Merritt said. It's structured to not look like one, Carver said. But yes. He set the document down. He thought about Marcus Webb, a name he didn't know, a face he hadn't seen, a corporal in the 3rd Battalion who had done everything right, hired an attorney, filed the paperwork, and then received a letter on senatorial letterhead and made a calculation. The same kind of calculation Fitch had made, the kind that men like Arthur Drayton made inevitable by controlling enough of the landscape that there was always a cost attached to standing up. Get this to Reyes, he said. Already scanned and transmitted, Carver said. He looked at her. When did you send it? 7 minutes before I came in here. She held his gaze. I wanted to have the conversation with you, sir, but the evidence needed to move first. It was the correct call. He would have made the same one. Good, he said. She nodded. Moved toward the door, then stopped. There's one more thing. Webb is still on base. 3rd Battalion. He hasn't been contacted by the FBI yet. Merritt stood up. Which building? It. Webb was in a training classroom in the 3rd Battalion's headquarters building, sitting through a vehicle maintenance certification review, when his platoon sergeant appeared at the door and called him out. He came into the corridor with the expression of a Marine who cannot immediately identify what he's done wrong, but is already reviewing the options. He saw Merritt standing at the end of the corridor and stopped moving entirely. Merritt walked toward him. Webb came to attention. At ease, Merritt said before he'd fully closed the distance. Walk with me. They walked down the corridor and out into the afternoon light. Overcast now, the coastal cloud layer rolling back in, the air carrying the particular damp weight that came before evening fog. Merritt walked at a pace that was not rushed. Webb matched it, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes forward. 8 months ago, Merritt said, you filed a civil claim against the Pelican Bluffs PD. Webb's jaw tightened. Yes, sir. And 5 months ago you withdrew it. A pause that had weight in it. Yes, sir. I'm not asking you to explain the withdrawal, Merritt said. I think I have a reasonable understanding of why it happened. I want to know about the stop itself. Another pause. Longer. Webb looked at the cloud layer for a moment, then back at the path ahead. He pulled me over on the approach lane, sir. Solo, no passengers. Coming back from Liberty. He said my taillight was out. It wasn't. He exhaled. He wanted me to consent to a vehicle search. I said no. He said he had probable cause based on the taillight violation. A beat. He had me prone on the asphalt for 20 minutes while he went through the vehicle. Glove box, center console, under the seats. He took my phone out of the cup holder and looked through it. Webb's voice was level, but the levelness was a thing he was managing, not a thing that came naturally in this moment. He found nothing, because there was nothing. He cited me for the taillight. The taillight was fine. How long were you on the ground? 23 minutes, sir. I counted. Merritt walked in silence for a moment, counted. The specific detail of a man lying on asphalt counting minutes, because it was the only thing he had control over. The FBI is going to contact you today, Merritt said. I want you to give them a full statement, everything. The stop, the search, the letter from the senator's office, what happened to your attorney's application, all of it. Webb looked at him for the first time directly. The letter, sir, how do you know about... Because Carver found it, Merritt said, and because that letter is now federal evidence in an obstruction case. Webb stopped walking. Merritt stopped with him. They were on the edge of the motor pool lot, and around them the ordinary sounds of the base continued. Engines, voices, the distant mechanical rhythm of something being repaired in the motor pool bay. Sir. Webb's voice dropped. Not from weakness, from the specific register of a person saying something they've needed to say for a long time and are now saying in the wrong order because the right order is hard to find. After I dropped the claim, for a while I thought I'd made the wrong call, and then I thought maybe it was just how things worked, and the wrong call was the call I was going to have to live with. He paused. I stopped driving off base at night. The sentence landed in the air between them with more weight than any of the others. Merritt looked at him. 23 years old. A Marine who had modified his own movements, his own liberty, his own life, to avoid a corridor controlled by one man with a badge and a senator's phone number. You didn't make the wrong call, Merritt said. You made the only call that was available to you at the time, with what you knew and what was being leveraged against you. He paused. The call that was wrong was made by the people who built that system and let it run. Another pause. That's what we're dealing with now. Webb looked at him for a long moment. Then he straightened slightly. Not to attention, not performed, just a shift in posture that was its own kind of statement. Yes, sir, he said. Merritt walked him back to the building and went to find Carver. At 1600, Reyes called. The letter is significant, she said. It potentially expands the conspiracy charge to include the senator's office. We're moving carefully. Political exposure at that level requires sign-off from the deputy AG, but we're moving, she paused. Colonel, I need to flag something for you. Go ahead. The district attorney's office. Richard Soltero. She said the name with a specific precision, the way you say the name of something you've identified and are now tracking. He's been in contact with the senator's chief of staff 3 times since this morning. We have the call logs. Nothing has been said explicitly, but the timing and frequency have our attention. Merritt had not encountered Soltero directly yet, but Carver had briefed him, the county DA, mid-40s, a man whose career was built on maintaining a specific kind of relationship with the police union that ran the Pelican Bluffs PD's pension board. Political animal, prosecutorial record that showed a consistent reluctance to push cases that might create friction with law enforcement. What are you expecting from him? Merritt asked. I'm not sure yet, Reyes said, but 3 calls to the senator's office in 6 hours suggests he's deciding something. I want you to know about it before he decides it. He thanked her and hung up. Walked to the window. The fog was coming in early. thin tendrils of it curling in from the ocean, softening the edges of the base's geometry, blurring the hard lines of the buildings into something watercolor and indistinct. He had not left the command building since walking back from the morning conversation with Webb. He had not eaten since the cold coffee he'd finished at 7:50. His shoulder was a consistent grinding complaint in the background of everything else. These were small facts, the ordinary body facts of a long day, and he noted them the same way he noted everything: catalogued, assessed, filed, not acted on yet. At 1700, Voss knocked and came in with two things: a container of food from the dining facility that she set on the corner of his desk without comment, and a printed update from Carver's office. Merritt ate 4 bites of whatever it was before reading the update. The update told him that Marcus Webb's formal statement had been recorded by Reyes's team at 16:30, that Yolanda Fitch's statement had been recorded at 15:45, that 2 additional enlisted Marines from the 2nd and 4th Battalions had come forward voluntarily, not contacted by the FBI, but arriving at the PM's office of their own initiative after the barracks current moved the word that the investigation was real and active and being run at the federal level. He set the update down. 4 Marines in one afternoon, 4 people who had been sitting with this for months or years, running their calculations, managing their movements, living inside the parameters that Drayton had set for the corridor outside his own gate. He had the thought that there would be more. He did not enjoy having it. At 1900, the call he'd been waiting for came. Not from Reyes, from a number he didn't recognize, which resolved into the office of District Attorney Richard Soltero. And the voice on the other end was not Soltero himself, but a senior assistant DA named Pamela Ortega, who introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been sent to make a call she did not choose to make. "Colonel Merritt," she said, "my office would like to schedule a meeting to discuss the scope of your cooperation with the federal investigation and the potential implications of the criminal charges currently filed against Officer Drayton." "My cooperation with the federal investigation is complete and ongoing," Merritt said. "What specifically does your office want to discuss?" A pause. "There are elements of the evidentiary record that the DA's office believes may have been collected outside the proper chain of custody. If those elements are challenged successfully, the federal case becomes significantly more complicated. We'd like to have a conversation about how to avoid that outcome." Merritt was quiet for a moment. He noted the specific architecture of what she'd just said: the passive voice, the word challenged, the implicit offer wrapped in language that plausibly deniable didn't quite cover it. "Ms. Ortega," he said, "are you calling to tell me that the DA's office is preparing to challenge the admissibility of the Sentinel surveillance footage?" Another pause. Longer. "We're exploring options." "The Sentinel system was operating within its standard protocol on installation property," Merritt said. "The footage was collected by Department of Defense equipment on federal land. There is no chain of custody challenge that survives that foundation." He kept his voice level. "What your office is actually exploring is whether there is a version of this situation that doesn't result in Richard Soltero having to explain his relationship with Senator Drayton's office to a federal oversight committee. And I want you to understand something clearly." He stopped, waited 1 beat. "There isn't." The line was quiet. He could hear, faintly, voices in the background of wherever Ortega was calling from. Office sounds, the indistinct audio of an organization in motion. "I'll relay your position to the DA," she said finally. "Please do," Merritt said, "and tell him that my legal staff is available if he wants a formal conversation, through proper channels." He hung up, stood up from the desk, walked to the window. The fog had come in fully now, thick and gray and total, erasing the perimeter fencing, the guard towers, the distant tree line, everything past about 40 yards. The base had shrunk to the immediate, to the lit windows of the nearest buildings and the sound of boots on wet pavement somewhere below. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Reyes. "Colonel," she said, and something in her voice had changed. Not alarm, not urgency, but the particular compression of someone delivering information that has changed the shape of what they're dealing with. "We've been pulling Drayton's personal communications as part of the federal warrant. There's something in there you need to know about." He waited. "He wasn't working alone in that corridor," Reyes said. "There are text exchanges going back 22 months between Drayton and 2 other Pelican Bluffs officers. They were coordinating specific targets, specific nights, specific shift rotations timed to gate sentry changes. They knew when the coverage gaps were. She paused. Someone was giving them that information. Someone who knew the gate rotation schedule. Merritt went very still. The gate rotation schedule. The shift changes at Gate 5. The information that would tell you exactly when the corridor outside the installation's main approach lane had the least experienced sentry on post, and exactly when a stop made in that corridor had the smallest chance of being observed and correctly reported. That information lived in exactly one place outside the installation's command structure. How many other officers? He asked. 2 confirmed so far, Reyes said. But Colonel, the schedule information, we're tracing where it came from, and what we're finding. She stopped. Then, we think it came from inside the installation. The fog pressed against the window. Somewhere below, boots on wet pavement, the ordinary sounds of a base at night. Merritt said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the window, at the gray nothing beyond it, at the way the fog made the world small and close and full of things you couldn't see. Send me everything you have, he said. Tonight. He set the phone down on the windowsill. Inside the installation. The gate rotation schedule. Someone inside this perimeter had been feeding information to a coordinated group of officers who had been running systematic predatory stops on his Marines for nearly 2 years. 12,000 people lived here. He was responsible for all of them. And somewhere among them, someone had been holding a door open from the inside, and Drayton and his partners had been walking through it, night after night, into the corridor where his people drove home. He picked the phone back up and called Voss. She answered on the first ring. I need you in my office, he said. Now, and bring Tacone. He heard her moving already, the sound of a chair, footsteps. On my way, sir. What's happened? He looked at the fog, at the gray and total erasure of everything beyond the glass. We have a leak, he said. Voss arrived in 4 minutes. Tacone arrived in 6, still pulling his jacket on, his hair carrying the evidence of a couch in the duty room. They sat across from Merritt's desk and listened without interrupting while he relayed what Reyes had told him, and when he finished, the room held the specific silence of people processing something that requires a full rearrangement of what they thought they were dealing with. Tacone spoke first. How specific was the schedule information they were using? Specific enough that they could time the stops to shift transitions, Merritt said. That's not guesswork. That's someone who knew the rotation in advance. How far in advance does the gate rotation get posted? Voss asked. 72 hours, Merritt said. Posted to the PM's internal server and distributed to shift NCOs. Tacone and Voss looked at each other. The math was not complicated. Access to that information meant access to the PM server or proximity to a shift NCO, which narrowed the pool, but not to a single person. Not yet. Reyes is tracing the access log, Merritt said. But that takes time, and I don't want to wait for the trace to tell me something the installation's own records might tell us faster. He looked at Voss. I want the gate rotation logs for the last 24 months pulled and cross-referenced against every stop Drayton and his partners made in the Gate 5 corridor, every stop. If the pattern holds, if they consistently work the transitions, that confirms the leak is tied to the schedule specifically, not just general intel. That's a significant data pull, Voss said. Yes. I can have it by 0600. 05, Merritt said. She didn't argue. She stood. I'll need PM records access and the Sentinel Archive Index. Carver will authorize it tonight. He looked at Tacone. Sergeant Major, the barracks current. Is there any talk in the NCO Corps about who might have had contact with Drayton's department on the outside? Tacone was quiet for a moment. He was a man who thought before speaking as a matter of discipline, not temperament, and the pause was the kind that indicated he was sorting through something real rather than constructing something convenient. There was a staff sergeant, he said finally, about a year ago. Gate duty assignment, Gate 5 area. He transferred out 8 months ago. Voluntary reassignment to Pendleton. He paused again. There were some questions at the time about an outside relationship. Not documented, nothing formal, just talk. He was friendly with some of the local PD. People thought it was just community relations, cops and military, crossover social circles. Name, Merritt said. Hollenbeck, Victor Hollenbeck. Merritt wrote the name down. Get that to Carver and to Reyes's team tonight. Tacone nodded. He stood, pulled his jacket straight. Sir, he stopped in the doorway. 22 months. That's a long time. Yes, Merritt said. It is. Tacone left. Voss was already on her phone in the corridor talking to someone in the PM's records office. The door closed, and Merritt was alone with the fog and the name he'd written on the notepad and the particular cold arithmetic of a betrayal that had been operational while he was somewhere else. In the Pentagon, in training cycles, in the ordinary demands of command, while his Marines drove home at night through a corridor that had been mapped and timed and handed to the wrong people. He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and called Reyes. What? Reyes had the name Hollenbeck in her system within 9 minutes of Merritt's call, which told him her team had already been moving in that direction even before he provided the specific identity. She confirmed the connection at 0130, text exchanges between a number registered to a prepaid phone, and Drayton's personal cell showed a consistent pattern of information. Not explicit, never the word schedule or rotation, but timing references. The kind of coded shorthand that develops between people who have done something enough times to stop having to explain it. The prepaid number had been purchased at a convenience store in Caris Point 14 months ago. The store's surveillance archive had been overwritten, but the carrier metadata showed the phone's signal had pinged 3 cell towers in consistent proximity to the Harmon installation's Gate 5 area during the months it was active, which placed it physically on or near the base. Hollenbeck had been Gate Assignment NCO for Gate 5 for 11 of those months. We're drafting the warrant, Reyes said. We'll have it executed at Pendleton by morning. Merritt thought about Hollenbeck. He couldn't place a face immediately. 11 months ago, a staff sergeant on a gate posting, one of dozens of NCOs cycling through duty assignments. The anonymity of it was its own kind of information. Someone who'd calculated that the landscape of a large installation offered exactly enough cover to be helpful in ways nobody would trace back. Someone who'd weighed his Marine's safety against something, money, favors, the social currency of being useful to people who had local power, and come to the wrong number. When you execute the warrant, Merritt said, I want to know within the hour. You'll know, Reyes said. He set the phone down. The fog outside was still total. He looked at his watch, 0147. He had not slept in 39 hours, a number he registered without significant feeling because the body in certain states stops treating exhaustion as an emergency and starts treating it as climate. He put his head back against the chair and closed his eyes for 10 minutes. Not sleep, just the darkness behind his eyelids and the sound of the building around him, the low mechanical hum of the HVAC system, a door somewhere down the corridor, the distant ocean that was always there even when you couldn't see or hear it directly. At 0200, he got up, went to the small bathroom off the suite, ran cold water over his face, looked at himself in the mirror for about 4 seconds, and went back to the desk. The cross-reference data that Voss delivered at 0453 was 61 pages of gate logs, stop records, and timestamp comparisons. And she had flagged the relevant patterns in red because she knew he would want to see the shape of it before he read the details. He looked at the flags. The pattern was not subtle. Of the 47 documented stops that Drayton and his 2 confirmed partners had made in the Gate 5 corridor over 22 months, 39 of them occurred within a 90-minute window of a gate sentry transition. The transitions happened every 6 hours. The stops clustered specifically around the early morning transitions. The 01 to 02 window, which was when the least experienced sentries rotated on and the response time from the PM's office was statistically longest due to reduced overnight staffing. Someone had read the installation's operational rhythms the way you read a tide chart, known when the water was low and walked across. 39 out of 47, Voss said. She was standing at the edge of the desk with a second cup of coffee she'd brought for him. She had not slept either. Her uniform was still pressed, which was a function of discipline rather than rest. The other 8 were either random or Drayton was testing coverage, seeing what the sentries would log. He was calibrating, Merritt said. Yes, sir. He turned a page. There was a table near the back that Carver had added, a column of names beside a column of dates, the confirmed Marines whose stops aligned with the transition windows. 19 names. He read them slowly. Some he recognized from unit rosters. Most he didn't. All of them had driven through that corridor in the hours when the tide was low and come out the other side changed in some way. A false charge, a broken wrist, a civil claim dropped under pressure, a man who stopped driving off base at night. He closed the folder. "This goes to Reyes at 06, he said. "Full package." "Already copied and staged," Voss said. "Sir, there's one more thing." She hesitated in a way that was unlike her. "Corporal Webb, Marcus Webb." "What about him?" "His platoon sergeant came to me last night after you spoke to Webb. The sergeant said that after Webb dropped the civil claim 8 months ago, his performance evaluations changed. Not dramatically, nothing that would flag a formal review. But his advancement recommendation for the next cycle was downgraded, from highly recommended to recommended." She paused. "The sergeant who downgraded it was transferred out 4 months ago, but the notation stayed." Merritt looked at the folder. "Carver. Already flagged it for the expungement review." "Good." He looked at her. "You've been up all night." "So have you, sir?" "I outrank you, so my poor decisions are my own problem." He stood. "Go get 2 hours. Be back by 07:30. We have work." She took the dismissed instruction without arguing, which told him she was more tired than she was showing. The door closed behind her and he stood alone in the office again, the first gray edge of morning beginning to dilute the darkness outside the window. The fog was thinning. He could see the shape of the nearest building now. The motor pool, its corrugated roofline emerging from the gray like something surfacing. At 06:15, Reyes called to confirm the warrant had been executed at the Pendleton Barracks. Victor Hollenbeck, 31 years old, staff sergeant, was in federal custody. He had not resisted. He had, by the account of the agent who made the arrest, looked at the warrant and said nothing for a very long time, and then asked if he could put on his boots. He had been separated from his duty station, his communications, and his service ID within the hour. The prepaid phone had not been found in his quarters, which Reyes had expected. It had almost certainly been disposed of, but the carrier metadata and the cross-reference data that Voss had compiled were enough to build the framework of the case without it. Hollenbeck would be charged with conspiracy, obstruction, and deprivation of rights. His attorney, appointed by noon, would spend the next 72 hours reading the evidence package and arriving at conclusions that would not be pleasant. Merritt received the confirmation, made a note, kept working. By 0800, the installation's command staff had been briefed in full, not the version that might circulate through the barracks, but the complete operational picture. The coordinated stops, the schedule leak, Hollenbeck's arrest, the scope of the DOJ review, the number of Marines affected. Merritt ran the brief himself, standing at the head of the conference table with no slides and no notes, speaking for 22 minutes with the kind of directness that left no room for the ambient spin that tends to fill information vacuums in closed organizations. When he finished, no one spoke for a moment. Then the operations officer, a major named Durbin, who had been at Harmon for 14 months and had the pragmatic, slightly weather-beaten look of a man who had stopped being surprised by institutions failing their people, said, "Sir, what do we tell the units about force protection outside the wire?" It was the right question and a hard one, because the honest answer involved acknowledging that for 22 months the perimeter had had a hole that nobody in the command structure had identified, and that the people who'd fallen through that hole were the ones the command structure was supposed to protect. "Tell them the truth," Merritt said. "Tell them what happened, what we found, and what we're doing. Tell them that the Gate 5 corridor is being covered by MP escorts for off-base transit until the Pelican Bluffs PD can demonstrate to the DOJ that their oversight structure is functional. Tell them that anyone who had a stop in that corridor in the last 2 years should come forward to the PM's office and that their accounts will be treated as protected disclosures. No career consequences. Full stop." He looked around the table. "Tell them we failed to protect them from this. That's what happened. Own it." The room was quiet. "Yes, sir," Durbin said. By 1000, the information was in motion throughout the installation in the way that command communication moves when it comes from the top and is delivered plainly, faster and more completely than rumor, which requires embellishment and loses fidelity at each pass. The PM's office began receiving walk-ins by 10:30. Marines coming in alone, in pairs, some in uniform, and some in PT gear, some accompanied by their NCOs, and some not. The accounts varied in detail and severity. All of them had the same basic structure: a stop on the Gate 5 corridor at night during a transition window that had ended in a way that left a mark even when it left no official record. By early afternoon, the count was at 26 individual accounts. Merritt received the running total from Carver every hour. He did not track it with satisfaction. He tracked it the way a field surgeon tracks a casualty count, clinically, because the number matters for what happens next, and with a steady background weight that doesn't lift just because you've identified the source. At 1300, District Attorney Richard Soltero made his decision. He made it public, which was the part nobody had fully anticipated. He called a press conference at the Pelican Bluff City Hall that was attended by local news and, within 20 minutes of the invitation going out, by regional bureaus who had been monitoring the situation since Grabble's original administrative leave statement. Soltero stood behind a podium in a gray suit and delivered a statement that had been clearly written by someone trying to thread a needle between accountability and self-preservation, and he threaded it badly. He announced that his office had conducted an independent review of the Drayton matter and had concluded that there was insufficient basis to challenge the federal jurisdiction over the case. He announced his support for the DOJ investigation. He announced that he had instructed his office to cooperate fully. He did not mention the 3 calls to the senator's chief of staff. He did not mention Pamela Ortega's call to Merritt's office. He did not mention Marcus Webb's dropped civil claim, or the letter on senatorial letterhead, or the Judicial Nomination Committee application that had been leveraged to make it happen. He answered 4 questions from reporters, none of them easy, all of them in the category of questions he had been hoping not to face, and at the end of the 4th answer, his press aide stepped to the microphone and said the DA had a prior commitment. The press conference footage reached Carver's desk at 1340. She watched 12 minutes of it, then summarized it for Merritt in 2 sentences. Soltero had publicly committed to cooperation, and he had done it badly enough to ensure that the questions he didn't answer would be louder in the next news cycle than the ones he had. He's trying to get ahead of something, Carver said. He's trying to survive it, Merritt said. There's a difference. She nodded. Reyes is going to want to talk to him. I know. He looked at the clock on the wall. Has the senator's office issued anything new? His chief of staff released a statement at 1100 confirming that the senator has instructed his staff to cooperate fully with the federal investigation and has engaged outside legal counsel. She paused. The outside legal counsel he engaged is one of the top federal criminal defense firms in Sacramento. Merritt absorbed that. Arthur Drayton had stopped trying to contain the situation and started preparing to survive the investigation personally. The shift from offense to defense, happening in real time, visible in the choice of legal representation. Good, Merritt said. At 1500, Reyes called with something that had not been on the morning's list of expected developments. Victor Hollenbeck had asked to speak with an FBI agent without his attorney present. His attorney had advised strongly against it. Hollenbeck had waived the advice. He spoke for 40 minutes. Reyes summarized the key points for Merritt in a call that lasted 8. Hollenbeck had been approached by Drayton 14 months ago through what Hollenbeck described as a social context, a barbecue at a mutual contact's house in Pelican Bluffs, the kind of event where military and local law enforcement mixed casually. Drayton had made the initial request seem innocuous, framed as interagency coordination. Knowing when the gate was busy and when it wasn't was useful for a patrol officer working the perimeter, he'd said. Community relations. Hollenbeck had provided the information twice before understanding what it was being used for, and by then he had said yes twice on a prepaid phone and stopped seeing a clean way to stop. He knew what was happening to his Marines? Merritt asked. Reyes's answer was careful. He says he didn't know the specifics of the stops. He says he told himself it was routine patrol coordination. She paused. Whether that's true or a story he built because he needed to function, I can't tell you. Merritt said nothing for a moment. He thought about Victor Hollenbeck deciding, at some point in the early months of this, that the distance between what he was doing and what was happening in the corridor was large enough to live in. How that distance probably shrank over time. How you maintained it anyway, because the alternative was facing what you'd already done. He's cooperating? Merritt asked. Fully, Reyes said. He's giving us names, dates, context. He's walked us through the communication pattern in detail. A beat. He's not going to avoid charges, but his cooperation is going to be relevant at sentencing. That's between him and the court, Merritt said. After the call, he sat without moving for a few minutes. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle now, the fog having fully retreated, the sky over the coast gone to a pale, hard blue. He could see the guard towers from where he sat, their silhouettes clear against the light. He thought about Hollenbeck at a barbecue 14 months ago, about Drayton making a request that sounded like coordination, about the distance between that moment and 26 Marines sitting in the PM's office that morning, describing what the corridor had cost them. He thought about how ordinary the beginning of something like this always looked, how it never announced itself. At 1700, Tacon appeared in the doorway again. He had the look of a man who has spent the day moving through the barracks, absorbing what people were feeling, which was his specific and essential function, and which cost him something every time in a way he never acknowledged. "Talk to me," Merritt said. Tacon came in, sat down, folded his hands. "The walk-ins to PM today. Word of that is through the whole installation. People are... It's not anger exactly. It's more like..." He searched. "Like when you've been compensating for something for so long that you stop noticing the weight of it, and then someone lifts it off and you realize how heavy it was." He paused. "That's what the barracks feel like tonight." Merritt nodded. "There's also something else," Tacon said. He shifted slightly in the chair, which for Taconi was the equivalent of visible discomfort. "Some of the senior NCOs are asking about the command's oversight failure, how this ran for 22 months without being flagged. They're not asking it hostilely. They're asking it the way good NCOs ask hard questions." "They're right to ask it," Merritt said. Taconi looked at him. "I'm going to address it formally," Merritt said, "in the all hands. I'm not going to explain it away or structure it as a systems failure that nobody is responsible for. It happened on my watch. That's what I'm going to say." Taconi was quiet for a moment. Sir, you weren't the Hollenbeck angle, the coordination. That wasn't something a routine oversight cycle would have caught." "Maybe not," Merritt said, "but the number of informal complaints that didn't make it to formal review, the culture that made those Marines feel like the formal channel wasn't worth the risk, that I can answer for. That's a command climate question." He looked at Taconi. "So I'm going to answer for it." Taconi nodded slowly. There was something in his face that was not agreement exactly, more the recognition of a man watching someone do something difficult correctly. "When's the all hands?" he asked. "Tomorrow, 0800. I'll have the battalions assembled." He left. Merritt turned back to the window. The last of the afternoon light was going now, the sky deepening toward the dark blue that preceded actual night. The guard towers were lit. Gate 5's approach lane was visible from this angle, the lane that had been the corridor of 22 months of coordinated harm, which was also the lane where the Delta barriers had come up, and the floodlights had hit, and 8 Marines had come out of armored vehicles moving with the particular intent of people who know exactly what they are defending. Both things were true. The corridor held both. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Reyes. Something in the hour of the call, not late enough for bad news, not scheduled, made him pick up with a particular attention. "Colonel," she said, "the records pull on Soltero's office just returned something. A file that was administratively closed 7 months ago. A formal complaint from a Marine, Gate 5 corridor, referred to the DA's office for review by the Pelican Bluffs PD watch commander." She paused. "Soltero's office received it, logged it, and then referred it back to the Pelican Bluffs PD as an internal matter." "Referred it back to the department being complained about," Merritt said. "To the watch commander who had already closed it once," Reyes said. "Yes." Another pause. "The Marine who filed that complaint, Colonel. The one that went to Soltero's office and came back with nothing." She stopped. "Her name is Yolanda Fitch." The room was very quiet. Merritt looked at the gate in the distance, at the lit approach lane, at the painted yellow line that was invisible from here but that he knew exactly where it was. 200 yards out, the boundary of what was his and what was not, the line that Drayton had crossed, and that Fitch had been standing behind with her binoculars when she identified his face and made the call that started all of this. Fitch had filed with Soltero's office. Soltero had sent it back to the department that employed Drayton, and Drayton had kept working the corridor for 7 more months, which meant Soltero had known. Not about the coordination, not about Hollenbeck, but about the pattern. About one Marine's formal account that had landed on his desk and been returned without action. "When are you moving on?" Merritt asked. "The obstruction warrant will be ready by 0800 tomorrow," Reyes said. "The DA's office will be served while he's in his morning staff meeting." He thought about that. About Soltero at his podium this afternoon. The careful language, the press aide stepping in. The morning staff meeting tomorrow. "There's something you should know," Reyes said. "When we serve the warrant, we'll have to disclose the specific evidence that triggered it, including Fitch's complaint and the referral record. That means Fitch's name will be in the warrant documentation. It will eventually become public record." Merritt looked at the gate. "She filed it," he said. "She put her name on it. That was already a decision she made." He paused. "I'll tell her tonight." "I'd appreciate that," Reyes said. "It's better coming from you." He hung up. He picked up his cover, walked to the door. Out into the corridor, through the building, out into the evening air that was cooling fast now, the fog already beginning to rebuild itself offshore. He walked toward the barracks, toward the building where the duty roster would tell him where Fitch was, on rest, post-shift, 20 years old, with a hairline fracture 14 months healed, and a formal complaint she'd filed that had gone to a DA's office and come back like a letter marked "Return to Sender." He was halfway across the motor pool lot when his phone buzzed. A text from Carver. "Soltero's office just called. He wants to speak to you directly. Tonight. His personal cell. Says it's urgent." Merritt looked at the message. At the timestamp. At the hour of the call that had just ended with Reyes, and the precise timing of Soltero reaching out 20 minutes after it. Soltero's office was calling him tonight, personally, urgently, which meant Soltero knew the warrant was coming, which meant someone inside Reyes's process had told him. Merritt stood in the motor pool lot with the fog coming in and the lights of the guard towers catching the first thin tendrils of it, and turned that piece of information over in his mind slowly, examining its edges. Reyes ran a tight operation. Her team was federal, vetted, compartmented. The warrant information was not wide. And yet, he typed back to Carver, "Don't confirm or deny. Tell his office I'm unavailable tonight." He put the phone in his pocket and kept walking toward the barracks. The warrant would be served at 0800. Soltero would be in his morning staff meeting. And whatever Soltero knew, or thought he knew, or had been told by someone who shouldn't have told him, that information was now one more piece of the picture, one more thread in a web that had been built over 22 months in the dark, and was now, in the flat and unforgiving light of a federal investigation, becoming visible in its entirety. He pushed open the barracks door. He had a 20-year-old Marine to find, and something difficult to tell her, and he was not going to let that be the next thing that happened to her without her being the first to know. Fitch was in the junior enlisted common room on the second floor of Barracks C, sitting at one of the long tables with a regulation manual open in front of her that she was not reading. Merritt could tell from the doorway, the specific stillness of someone staring at a page without seeing it, their focus somewhere entirely different from the text. Two other Marines were at the far end of the room watching something on a laptop with headphones in, and they scrambled to attention when Merritt came through the door. "As you were," he said. He looked at Fitch. "Corporal, walk with me." She closed the manual without marking her page, which confirmed she hadn't been reading it, and followed him into the corridor. They walked to the end of the hall where there was a window that looked out onto the quad, lit now by the overhead floods, a rectangle of empty concrete bordered by the low shapes of the surrounding buildings. Merritt stopped there and turned to face her. He told her about the warrant, about her complaint reaching Soltero's office 7 months ago, about it being referred back to the Pelican Bluffs PD watch commander without action, about the fact that her name would be in the public warrant documentation when Soltero was served tomorrow morning. She listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't collapse. She was too controlled for that, or too tired, or both. But something around her eyes changed in a way that was harder to look at than open distress. The particular face of someone being told that the worst thing they'd suspected about what happened to them was actually true. "He had it," she said when he finished. "Yes." "For 7 months." "Yes." She looked at the window. At the lit quad below, a Marine jogging across it, cutting diagonally toward the chow hall. She watched until the figure disappeared around the corner of the building. "When I filed with the DA's office," she said, "I thought I was doing it right. The complaint to the PD watch commander hadn't gone anywhere, so I went up a level. I thought that was the system working." She paused. And then I didn't hear anything for a month and She stopped. I decided it was gone. I decided to stop pulling at it because every time I pulled it just showed me more rope. Merritt looked at her. 20 years old. A formal complaint, a proper escalation, the right channel used correctly. And the right channel had taken it and handed it back to the source and left her to believe for 7 months that she'd run out of options. Your complaint is what links Soltero to the pattern, he said. Without that documented referral, what he did is harder to prove. The fact that you filed it, even though it went nowhere, that record existed, and it's the record that's going to matter tomorrow. He paused. You didn't pull on a rope and find more rope. You documented a crime and a cover-up, both of those things. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't feel like I was documenting anything, she said. I felt like I was shouting into a wall. I know, he said. That's what it's supposed to feel like. That's the point of making the wall. He looked at the window with her. The point of making people feel like the system won't move is to make them stop pushing. And when they stop pushing, the people running the system don't have to do anything. They just wait. He paused. You kept the record. That's what broke it open. She looked at him. There was something in her face that was working toward a question, and he waited for it. Sir, she said, when the warrant documentation goes public, my name in there, what does that do to my file? It was the right question, the practical one, the career question, the one she was carrying because she was 20 years old and the Marine Corps was what her life was built on right now, and she'd been burned by this process once already and needed to know the cost. Your file already has a disorderly conduct notation in it that is being expunged this week, he said. What gets added in its place is the record of a formal complaint that led to a federal obstruction of justice case against a sitting district attorney. That's what Carver is going to make sure is documented correctly. He held her gaze. Your file is going to look like the file of someone who did the right thing repeatedly, under conditions designed to make that impossible. She blinked. Once. Then looked back at the window. Okay, she said quietly. Not okay meaning it was fine, not okay meaning she wasn't still carrying the weight of it, just okay meaning she had heard him and would hold on to it and would keep moving. Go get some sleep, Corporal, he said. She came to attention, rendered the salute, and walked back down the corridor. He watched her go. The regulation manual was still on the table in the common room. He thought about the version of Yolanda Fitch, who would have become someone else entirely if the wall had worked, if she'd stopped pushing, transferred out, built a life around the gap where her complaint had disappeared. That version wasn't hard to imagine. He'd known people shaped by exactly that process. The ones who never quite recovered the specific confidence of believing that the system could be moved. He walked back through the barracks and out into the night. The all hands at 0800. The next morning was the largest formation Harmon installation had assembled outside of a scheduled exercise in 2 years. All 4 battalions, plus support units and civilian contractors who'd been invited at Merritt's direction. 12,000 people was not a number that fit on a parade ground comfortably, but the installation had a main assembly area built for exactly this scale, and it was full. Merritt stood at the single microphone without notes. He had decided against notes the night before, sitting at his desk with a blank page in front of him for 20 minutes, and then putting the pen down. Notes created the possibility of the wrong word in the wrong order. What he was going to say needed to come in the sequence that was true, and the true sequence was one he knew from the inside out. He told them what had happened. Not the managed version, not the version that contained the institutional reflexes that push passive voice and systemic language between a command and its accountability. He said, on my watch, in this corridor for 22 months, a coordinated group of officers ran predatory stops targeting the Marines of this installation. He said, someone inside this perimeter gave them the information they needed to do it effectively. He said, 26 of you have come forward, and I believe there are more who haven't yet, and the door is still open. He said, the complaints that should have moved through our system and didn't. That is a command climate failure, and I own it, and we are going to build something different on the other side of this. The assembly area was quiet in the way that 12,000 people can be quiet. Not silence, because that many bodies always carry ambient sound, but a focused, collective attention that had weight. He told them about Fitch, not her name. She hadn't given him permission for that, and he didn't need it for what he was saying. He told them that a Marine on this installation had identified him in handcuffs from 200 yards away in bad light and fog, and had made the right call in under 30 seconds. He told them that same Marine had filed a formal complaint with the DA's office 7 months ago that had been buried, and that the record of that buried complaint was now the linchpin of a federal obstruction case. He told them that the system had failed her and that she had created the evidence of its failure anyway, without knowing that's what she was doing, just by being the kind of Marine who documents things correctly even when it doesn't seem to matter. The people who build walls to stop you from being heard, he said, are counting on you deciding the wall is the end of the road. They're counting on your exhaustion. They're counting on the math of how much it costs to keep pushing against something that doesn't move. When you push anyway, when you file the complaint and keep the record and don't let the thing die quietly, you are denying them the only tool they actually have. Because the wall only works if you stop. He looked out at the assembly area, at the rows of utilities and covers and faces that ranged from very young to not particularly young, the full human range of an institution that asked a great deal of people, and on its best days gave them something real back for it. We failed some of you, he said. That's true, and I'm not going to put language around it that makes it sound like less than it is. What I can tell you is what happens now. The investigation is federal, it is thorough, and it will not stop at the edges of what's convenient. Everyone who had a stop in that corridor has access to the PM's office and to the DOJ review process. The MP escort protocol for off-base transit in the Gate 5 area is active until further notice. And anyone who tells you that coming forward has a career cost, send them to me. He stepped back from the microphone. The response was not applause, which would have been the wrong thing, and they knew it. It was something quieter and more real. A collective exhale, a shift in posture across 12,000 people, the physical expression of a weight being redistributed from private to shared. Oh. Soltero was served the warrant at 0847 in the middle of his morning staff meeting by 2 federal agents who walked through the door of the Pelican Bluff City Hall conference room while a junior ADA was presenting quarterly conviction statistics on a projection screen. Soltero looked at the warrant for a long time before he looked up. His staff watched him read it and then watched his face do several things in quick succession that his face had never been asked to do in a public setting. He did not resist. He did not make a statement. He stood up, asked his senior ADA to reschedule the morning's court appearances, and walked out with the federal agents in a silence that his press aide, waiting in the lobby with a coffee, was completely unprepared for. The footage of Soltero leaving the building, shot by a local journalist who had been in the lobby for an unrelated appointment and recognized the federal agents from a previous story, was on the regional news by 9:30. By 10:15 it had moved to national feeds, and the story attached to it now included the full architecture. Drayton, the coordinated stops, Hollenbeck, the schedule leak, the letter to Marcus Webb's attorney, Fitch's complaint buried in Soltero's office. The pieces had been building in the public record for 36 hours, and the footage of Soltero walking out of City Hall gave the story its shape. Merritt watched approximately 4 minutes of coverage on the monitor in his office, and then turned it off. He had work to do, and the news would continue without his attention. What he did read, because Carver sent it directly to his terminal, was the statement released at 10:40 by Senator Arthur Drayton's office. It was 3 paragraphs long and had clearly been written by the criminal defense firm the senator had retained, rather than by anyone on his own staff. The language had the precise, clean quality of people who know which words create liability and which words create distance. The statement expressed the senator's horror at the pattern of conduct that had been uncovered. It expressed his commitment to full cooperation with all relevant investigations. It noted that his office had immediately terminated the chief of staff upon learning of the letter sent to Marcus Webb's attorney, effective that morning. It did not mention the senator's own calls to the Pentagon in the hours after the incident, or the calls to Grabble, or the 3 conversations with Soltero's office. What the statement did, in 3 careful paragraphs, was step back from the blast radius of his nephew's choices and the choices of the people who had tried to contain the consequences. It was a survival document, not an accountability document. Merritt recognized the difference and noted it without surprise. Arthur Drayton would face a federal investigative review of his office's role in suppressing the Webb claim and in the post-incident contacts with Soltero. Whether that review would result in charges depended on how deep the evidence of direct coordination went and how aggressively Reyes's team pursued it. That was not Merritt's decision. That was the process. And he had learned a long time ago that the process was only as good as the people running it in a given moment, and that what you could do was make sure the evidence was complete and then trust that the people running it in this moment were the right ones. Reyes struck him as the right one. At 1100, Marcus Webb was called to the PM's office. Carver was there, along with a JAG staff attorney who had spent the morning preparing a formal document. The document was a complete expungement of the disorderly conduct notation from Webb's service jacket, a restoration of his advancement recommendation to its original highly recommended status, and a formal retroactive dating of both, which meant that, for the record, the downgraded evaluation had never existed. Webb read the document twice. Then he signed it. Then he sat back in the chair with the specific stillness of someone who has just had something returned that they had stopped expecting to see again. "There's one more thing," Carver said. She pushed a second document across the table. Webb looked at it. It was a formal commendation, drafted by Merritt and signed that morning. It cited Webb's decision to pursue legal remedies following an unlawful stop, documented the interference with that process by identified actors, and commended his conduct throughout. It would go into his permanent record alongside the expungement and the corrected evaluation. "Sir, this," he started. "That's what the record should look like," Carver said. "That's what we're making it look like." He folded his hands on the table. He was 23 years old with a very straight spine and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has gotten through something difficult by refusing to let it reshape him in a direction he didn't choose. He looked at the commendation for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words, and they carried a great deal. Carver accepted them with a nod and didn't add anything, because some things don't need to be elaborated on. Kyle Drayton's federal preliminary hearing took place in a downtown San Diego courtroom 3 weeks after the night on the approach lane. Merritt was not present. He had been present for the evidence review, for the meetings with Reyes's team, for the all-hands and the command reviews, and the long bureaucratic work of rebuilding the oversight structure at Gate 5. He did not need to be in the courtroom for Drayton's hearing to know what was happening there. What he knew, because Carver sent him the summary, was that Drayton had entered a guilty plea to 3 of the 5 federal charges: assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of law, and conspiracy, as part of a cooperation agreement that required him to provide full testimony against the 2 partner officers and against Hollenbeck. The remaining 2 charges were held in abeyance pending cooperation compliance. Sentencing was scheduled for 60 days out. Victor Hollenbeck pled guilty on the same day. No cooperation agreement. He had already given the FBI everything he had in the voluntary statement, and the agreement was implicit in the thoroughness of what he'd provided. His sentencing was scheduled for 90 days. Richard Soltero did not plead guilty. He hired a second defense attorney and indicated his intention to contest the obstruction charges, which was his right and which Reyes had fully anticipated. What Reyes had also anticipated, and which became clear in the pretrial filings, was that Soltero's defense strategy would require him to argue that referring Fitch's complaint back to the PD watch commander was a legitimate exercise of prosecutorial discretion, not suppression. That argument required Soltero's team to put Fitch's complaint and its handling at the center of the case, which meant the public record would contain in exhaustive detail exactly what had been done with the complaint of a 20-year-old Marine who had done everything right. Merritt read the pretrial filing summary on a Tuesday morning over coffee that was actually hot for once. He read the part about Soltero's defense strategy twice. Then he set the document down and looked at the window for a moment. Soltero's strategy was going to fail. Reyes's team had the metadata, the referral record, the timing of the Hollenbeck connection, and 3 months of phone logs showing the communications between Soltero's office and the senator's chief of staff. Prosecutorial discretion did not survive evidence that the discretion was coordinated with a political actor whose nephew was the subject of the suppressed complaint. The math was not survivable, but the trial would be public, and Fitch's name would be in every motion and every filing and every news summary of the case for however many months it ran. He called Fitch that afternoon. Not into his office, not a formal meeting, just a phone call, which felt like the right register for what he needed to say. She answered on the second ring, off duty, her voice carrying the slight guardedness of someone who has gotten used to news arriving through this particular channel. "I wanted you to hear it from me before you read it," he said. He told her about Soltero's defense strategy, about her complaint being central to the public record of the trial, about the months ahead. She was quiet for a moment. He let the quiet be. He's going to try to say he was doing his job, she said. Yes, by sending it back to the people who started it. Yes. Another pause. And the case is going to show that he wasn't. Yes, Merritt said. That's exactly what the case is going to show. She breathed, not a sigh, something more deliberate than that. The specific breath of someone who has found the ground under their feet, is solid and is checking it before they put full weight on it. Okay, she said, the same word as before. Same register. Still not meaning it was fine, meaning she would carry it and keep moving. There's something else, he said. I'm putting your name forward for a formal commendation, not administrative. A meritorious service citation based on your actions the night of the incident and your conduct throughout the subsequent investigation. He paused. Carver is drafting it. It'll go into your permanent record. A longer silence this time. Sir, she said, and her voice had a quality in it he hadn't heard from her before. Not younger exactly, but more unguarded than the controlled cadence she'd maintained in every room they'd been in together. I just looked through the binoculars. I just made a radio call. You made the radio call that started all of this, he said. You made it correctly, under conditions that gave you every reason to hesitate. And 14 months before that, you filed a complaint that went into a system designed to bury it, and instead became the evidence that dismantled that system. He paused. That's two things. Both of them matter. Both of them go on record. He heard her swallow. Thank you, sir, she said. He said goodbye and hung up and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, outside his window. The afternoon was clear, one of those coastal winter afternoons where the light comes in low and cold and precise, cutting hard shadows off every edge and making the ordinary geometry of the base look architectural and intentional. The guard towers, the motor pool roof, the long flat run of the approach road toward Gate 5. He looked at it all and felt the particular tiredness that is not about sleep, the tiredness that comes from having moved through something large and sharp and come out the other side still functional, which is not the same as intact. Well, the sentencing happened on a Thursday in April, in the same San Diego federal courtroom. The cases were heard sequentially, Hollenbeck first, then Drayton, then the two partner officers who had pled out in the weeks following Drayton's agreement. Merritt was present for Drayton's sentencing. He sat in the gallery in civilian clothes, the dark suit, no tie, and listened to the federal judge, a woman in her late 50s with a record for precision and a particular impatience with cases where institutional authority had been used as a weapon against the people it was supposed to protect. The judge read through the charges and the agreed statement of facts with an efficiency that left no room for softening. When she reached the section describing the coordinated stops and the schedule coordination, she paused, not theatrically, just long enough to indicate that she had read the number of affected individuals and intended to weight it correctly. Mr. Drayton, she said, looking down from the bench at the man in the chair who bore almost no resemblance to the officer who had been on the Gate 5 approach lane 4 months ago. The swagger was gone completely. He was thin in a way he hadn't been, and his hands were folded in his lap with the careful stillness of someone who has learned too late to manage his own movements. You were given authority by the public. You were given a badge, a vehicle, a weapon, and a zone of responsibility, and you used all of those things to build a private operation that systematically targeted people you had categorized as beneath your concern. You did not do this impulsively. You did this consistently, for nearly 2 years, with planning and coordination and the explicit exploitation of information obtained through betrayal. She stopped. You are not someone who made a mistake. You are someone who made a system. She sentenced him to 78 months in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release and a permanent bar from law enforcement or any position of public trust. The gavel came down. Drayton turned in his chair, and for a moment he looked at the gallery. Not at Merritt specifically. His gaze moved across the rows of people who had come to watch the end of this. But Merritt was there, and when Drayton's eyes moved through that section, they stopped, briefly, before moving on. Merritt's expression didn't change. He watched the marshals bring Drayton to his feet and move him toward the side door of the courtroom. He watched the door close. Then he looked at the judge, who was already reviewing the next file. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light was the specific pale gold of early spring on the coast, the kind of light that makes everything look briefly clarified. Merritt stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the street. The city moved around him. People, traffic, the ordinary machinery of a Thursday afternoon. Carver came out behind him. She stood next to him without speaking for a moment, looking at the street. "Soltero's trial starts in 6 weeks," she said. "I know." "He's still contesting." "He's going to lose," Merritt said. She nodded. They both knew the math on Soltero's case, and the math was not survivable. Reyes's team had delivered it with a completeness that left no significant gaps. The trial would be public and thorough, and the outcome would be public and thorough. That was what the evidence required, and the evidence was complete. "Sir," Carver said, then stopped. "Go ahead." 4 months ago, on that approach lane, when they put the cuffs on, she was looking at the street. What was going through your head? He thought about that. About the specific contents of 45 seconds on the hood of his Trailblazer with his wrists pinched in steel and the gate lit up 200 yards away and a voice behind him using language designed to reduce him to something manageable. "I was counting the distance to the gate," he said, "and deciding whether the sentries had a sight line." She looked at him. "And I was thinking about my Marines," he said. "The ones who make that drive every night in vehicles that don't announce who they are. The ones who don't have a garrison of armed personnel 200 yards away." He paused. "I was thinking that what was happening to me in that moment had been happening to people I was responsible for, and I hadn't known, and that if I handled what was in front of me correctly, maybe that changed." "And if you'd handled it wrong?" she asked. He thought about that too, about the version of that night where he'd lost the disciplined thread of it, where the word Drayton had used had found something underneath the control and the calculation and the decades of training, and he'd given Drayton the reaction Drayton had been looking for. "Then none of this happens," he said. "The footage still exists. The pattern is still there. But the narrative is different, and the narrative is what determines whether the evidence gets heard." She nodded slowly. "The system worked because you held the line." "The system worked because Fitch held the line," so he said. "And because Webb filed the complaint. And because the record existed." He looked at the street. "I just stayed calm long enough to give the record time to matter." He drove back to the installation alone. The same Trailblazer, the same stretch of coastal highway, the same approach to the Gate 5 corridor as the night 4 months ago. It was mid-afternoon, broad daylight, the fog entirely absent, the Pacific to his west catching the light in long silver strips between the tree line. He slowed as he approached the gate. The new sentry protocol had been in place for 3 months. 2 sentries on every shift at Gate 5 now, instead of 1. Communication panels upgraded, the response time from the PM's office to the approach lane cut from 4 minutes to 90 seconds by the repositioning of the overnight QRF. He'd overseen the redesign personally with Voss and Tacone in the 2 weeks after the all-hands. He also had, in the operational budget he'd submitted to Marine Corps headquarters 6 weeks ago, a formal proposal for a boundary marker upgrade, high-visibility embedded lighting along the federal jurisdiction line at all 3 primary approach lanes. Not paint, not a stripe on asphalt that could fade or be ignored in the dark. Embedded LED arrays that were visible from 100 yards in any weather condition at any hour. The kind of line that announced itself, that removed the plausible deniability of an officer who claimed not to have seen it. The proposal had been approved 2 weeks ago. Installation was scheduled for May. He pulled into the approach lane and stopped at the gate. The sentry, a young corporal he didn't recognize yet, new to the posting, came to the window with the efficient courtesy of someone running the protocol correctly. Merritt presented his credentials. The sentry checked them, verified, and waved him through with the crisp professional motion of someone who had been trained on the right version of this. "Evening, Colonel," the sentry said. "Evening, Corporal," Merritt said. "Good post." He drove through and onto the installation's main road, past the motor pool and the barracks blocks, and the training buildings, the machinery of the base moving around him in its ordinary late-afternoon rhythm. He thought about the boundary line, about what it meant and what it didn't mean. The line marked where federal jurisdiction began, where his authority and his responsibility were legally clear. It was important. It had mattered enormously on the night 4 months ago. But the line on the asphalt was not the reason his Marines had been safer in the months since. They were safer because the people who had exploited the corridor were in federal custody or awaiting trial, because the oversight structure had been rebuilt with the specific vulnerabilities in view, because 26 people had walked into the PM's office and given accounts that were now part of the federal record and the DOJ review, because Yolanda Fitch had looked through binoculars in the fog and known a face and made the call and done all of it correctly from the first moment to the last. The line on the asphalt was where the law was written. The safety was where the people were. He pulled up to the command building and parked. Sat in the Trailblazer for a moment with the engine off and the coastal afternoon quiet around him. Through the windshield, he could see the flag on the building's roof, still in the light wind, barely moving, and below it the ordinary human traffic of the installation's late shift changeover, people moving in and out of the building in utilities and cover, carrying the tools of whatever the next 8 hours required of them. 12,000 people. His responsibility, every one of them, on the base and off it, in uniform and out of it, in the moments when the institution they'd signed up for was functioning as intended, and in the moments that were always coming, that you couldn't prevent but could prepare for, when it wasn't. He got out of the Trailblazer, pulled his jacket straight, went inside. On his desk was a message from Reyes, a brief one, a heads up that the DOJ review of the full 3-year stop record had identified 31 cases involving Marines or affiliated civilians that met the threshold for wrongful prosecution. Those 31 cases were being flagged for formal review and potential vacation of any resulting charges or notations. Reyes expected the formal vacation orders to be issued within 60 days. 31 cases. 31 people for whom the record was going to change, not because the system had worked for them at the time, but because enough people had refused to let the buried record stay buried, and the accumulated weight of that refusal had eventually become impossible to hold down. He read the message, made a note to call Reyes in the morning, set the document in the outbox. He thought, as he often did and had been doing more frequently in the months since the approach lane, about the version of that night where Fitch hadn't been at the gate, where a less experienced sentry had logged the police lights and turned back to the desk, where the armored vehicles hadn't come, where the limits of his ability to outlast that situation without institutional support had been found. He did not think about it with fear. He thought about it because the gap between that version and what actually happened was not fate and was not luck. It was a Marine who had been trained to see correctly, who cared enough to act on what she saw, and who had built the muscle memory of doing the right thing through 17 months of posting at a gate that most people walk through without thinking. The margin between the wrong version and the right version was one person paying attention. That was always the margin. In combat, in command, in the ordinary infrastructure of an institution that was only as functional as the people inside it who chose, moment by moment, to hold the standard. One person seeing clearly and moving on what they saw. One person keeping the record when the record seemed to matter to no one. One person making the radio call. The system did not protect people. People protected people, using the system as a tool when it worked and as evidence when it failed. He picked up his pen, went back to work. 2 months later, on a Friday afternoon in early summer, with the coastal light coming in clear and the ocean running a deep dark blue past the tree line, a small group assembled on the parade deck outside the command building. No ceremony was scheduled on the base calendar for that day. What was happening was not a ceremony in the formal sense. No dress uniforms, no band, no reviewing stand. Just a formation of about 40 people. Merritt, Voss, Tacone, Carver, a scatter of command staff, and the individuals being recognized. Merritt stood at the center and presented 4 formal commendations, reading each citation himself, without handing it to an aide. Marcus Webb received his first. The citation read his name and his unit and described, in the flat, precise language of military commendation, the actions of a Marine who had pursued legitimate legal remedies following a documented unlawful stop, maintained his professional conduct throughout a period of institutional obstruction, and provided testimony that contributed materially to a federal civil rights investigation. Webb stood at attention while Merritt pinned the commendation to his chest. He looked straight ahead the whole time, his jaw set in the way of someone determined not to show what the moment cost him to receive. Merritt didn't ask him to look at the camera. There was no camera. 3 other Marines received their commendations. Each citation was specific, the exact action, the exact date, the exact material contribution. Not general language about courage or service. The particular thing each of them had done and why it had mattered. Yolanda Fitch received hers last. Merritt read her citation in the same flat, precise voice, and when he was done reading, he looked at her, at attention, cover level, eyes forward, and said quietly enough that only she and the people nearest could hear it, "Outstanding Marine." She kept her eyes forward, but something in her posture shifted in that barely visible way, the same movement he'd seen in the corridor of the barracks 2 months ago, the weight redistributing. Afterward, the group broke into the loose, informal clusters of people who have been through something together and recognize each other for it without needing to say so. Tacone was talking to Webb, Voss was talking to Carver. Merritt stood at the edge of the parade deck and looked at the gate. Gate 5, visible in the distance, the approach lane leading to it empty in the afternoon light. Fitch appeared beside him. She looked at the gate too. "The boundary lights go in next week," he said. "I heard," she said. "You'll be able to see the line from the guard shack on a clear night." "Good," she said. Then, "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." She was quiet for a moment, finding the question. "When you drove back through the gate that night, after everything, what did it feel like?" He thought about it honestly, which meant he thought about the shoulder that had been stiff for a week, and the cold coffee, and the 26 Marines who had sat in the PM's office, and the name Hollenbeck written on a notepad, and the fog that had made the world small and close, and full of things you couldn't see. "Like there was work to do," he said, "and I was still standing." She nodded. That was apparently the right answer, or close enough to it. They stood for a moment, both looking at the gate. The approach lane. The line that would be lit from the inside starting next week, so that no one could cross it in the dark, and later claim they hadn't seen where they were. "Dismissed, Corporal," he said. She snapped the salute. He returned it. She walked back toward the cluster of people on the parade deck, and he watched her go. And then he turned back toward the command building because Carver had a document ready for his signature, and Reyes had a follow-up call scheduled at 1500, and the operational calendar for next month needed a final review before Monday. The work did not stop. It was not supposed to stop. The work was the point, not the fight, not the vindication, not the moment when the gavel came down in a federal courtroom and 31 wrongful cases began moving toward vacation. Those things mattered. They were necessary. But they were not the destination. The destination was the gate functioning correctly, the record being kept accurately, the next Marine who drove off the installation at night coming home without having to decide whether the system was worth the cost of using it. That was what you built. Not a monument to what had happened, a structure strong enough that the next version of it didn't. Merritt walked inside. The door closed behind him. Through the window of the command building, the parade deck was emptying slowly, people moving back to their units and their work. The afternoon light holding gold and clean over the installation as the sun moved west toward the water. The line would be lit next week. The record was complete. The work continued. There are people in this world who use authority not as a tool for protection, but as a weapon for control. They depend on silence. They depend on the calculation that speaking costs more than staying quiet. They build walls specifically so that the people behind them will eventually stop pushing. And they are right. Most of the time. Most of the time, the wall, because the cost of pushing is real, and the result of pushing is uncertain. And the people on the other side of the wall have more power and more patience and more structural support than any single person filing a complaint into a system that doesn't want to move. But they are wrong about one thing. They believe the silence they create is permanent. They believe that the buried record stays buried. They do not account for the person who keeps the document when no one is watching, who writes the date and signs the name and files the form, even when the form seems to disappear into nothing, because that person is not filing into nothing. They are filing into the future. They are creating the evidence that the next investigation needs, the record that the next Reyes will pull, the thread that the next Voss will follow back to the source. The wall